Today on Radio Free History, it's episode 14 of How Art Got Ugly. We take a look at the architecture of the 1930s, including the architecture of the Soviet Union, the Third Reich, and the origin of modernist architecture movements like brutalism and the international style that tried to build a world out of reinforced concrete, steel, and glass. Last year, they were supposed to open the Barack Obama Presidential Library in Chicago. Now, as a testament to DEI, it's been pushed back a year and a half.
Oh, they hired someone they shouldn't have.
I think they hired a lot of people they shouldn't have, including the architect, the designer. Since, the Obama campaign had such an iconic poster, Hope and Change, what do you expect the Barack Obama Presidential Library to look like?
Something uplifting?
Let's take a look. This is it in progress.
So it looks like the Tower of Mordor?
Let's be fair here. I mean, this is in progress. Let's maybe look at it from a different angle. Maybe it will be more uplifting. It's not looking any better to me right now.
Oh, that looks like if you told me that Saruman lived in here, I'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. That tracks. This is Isengard.
It looks like refuse from an AT-AT walker or something. Not the full AT-AT, like after after it's been taken down and a couple pieces have been taken off of it.
Yeah, it looks like a crashed spaceship from like a video game from like early 90s.
This is a more panoramic view of it. I don't think it looks any better.
It's like the kind of thing you design if you had to worry about like artillery. Like, that's my take on this. Like, I think, what does that say about your giant hegemonic superpower if you got to build concrete reinforced libraries? Like
Chicago is a beautiful city if you ignore certain parts of the South Side. This ain't it.
No.
But, like I said, we are maybe not being fair here. This is it under construction. This is still a gigantic hole in the ground. Let's be fair and look at the artist rendering of it, see what it's intended to look like. It's still not helping any.
looks like one of them Chinese lanterns. They're always letting off there a little bit.
So that part on the upper left is supposed to be words that are inspirational that you can read. Now, it's one of the first things they teach you in art school is don't put words on things because nobody's going to read it.
Yeah, and if it's like, they only work one way, they're backwards if you're looking out the window. Like,
show, don't tell.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at that text there. Let's see if maybe it's inspirational now that the letters have been put on the building.
Maybe some Abraham Lincoln stuff.
Look at this.
Your America unconstrained.
It wraps around the side. Like,
so you can't even read
this?
This is terrible. This hurts my eyes. Like, I know, like I am dyslexic, but this is really difficult to read. This runs together. This is
the worst memes are wall of text.
Yeah. Yeah, this is great point. This is like a left-wing meme.
This is a wall of text that you rubberneck at off the highway.
Oh, yeah. I don't need to drive my car. I have a Tesla. Read stuff.
Growing up, we were always told that that the milestone that the Americans were trying to reach was having a black president, and once that happened, it would usher in an age of utopia. That happened almost 20 years ago, and I'm not seeing any utopia here.
The race relations have gotten worse since then.
In the 80s, every scientist was played by a black guy in Hollywood, and nobody even noticed.
Remember Phil Huxtable?
Yep.
Uncle Phil?
Or Heath Huxtable.
Yeah.
They're all the same.
But, I think it's like all these black professionals. It was just, no, now. Mm-hmm. I think the cell phone camera has really, unfortunately, disillusioned a lot of people.
Yeah, and for those of you who are too young to remember the 90s, there were lots of complaints. You only show black people as criminals in the media. First of all, no, we didn't. Second of all, we probably should have.
Yeah. As a warning.
We all know that Hitler was rejected by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts in the 1900s. According to Mein Kampf, which, as we said last time, is admittedly a very unreliable narrator, Hitler was told that his talents lay more in architecture than in painting. He was told that his paintings of landscapes and buildings had a little bit of potential, but his paintings of the human form lacked expression or vitality or really anything inspirational. We looked at some of Hitler's paintings last time. They were not good,
No.
especially the ones with human form in them.
Yeah, it's terrible.
We've all heard the expression, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I have spent the last year and a half looking at a lot of so called art that I think is ugly and everyone else thinks is ugly as well. The only defense I've ever heard of this stuff is you need to refine your tastes to the point where you have to mull over the ugliness for a little while before the meaning sets in. That's not what I'm looking for in art. I don't think it's what anybody's looking for in art.
No, if you're not what Skinner would call a primary stimulus,
Yeah.
you failed. If what you've produced doesn't invoke passion or something in people,
Yeah.
something then you failed instantly. So
I'm starting to agree with some of the old philosophers who believed that beauty is an objective quality intrinsic to an object and external to the mind of the observer. I know that philosophers have been bullshitting about this since the 18th century. That no, there's no objective beauty out there. I'm starting to give this 18th century stuff another thought because look at this on the screen. This is not beautiful.
no, somebody needs to be like, this is hideous. But no,
Not only everybody thinks it's hideous for the same reason.
Yep, it's just intrinsic. There's something deep in our nature that rejects this kind of nonsense.
When Hitler came to power in 1933, he used his royalties from Mein Kampf to buy a chalet in the Bavarian Alps. He had it extensively remodeled and expanded into an alpine villa called the Berghof, or the Mountain Court. Now,
Nazi Shire.
I've read very mixed opinions on this place, including that it looked amateurish, that it looked like a chalet aspiring to a chateau because he didn't tear down the old cottage before he built this on top of it.
Practical people, the Germans.
Hitler being Hitler, he had to be the guy who oversaw most of the design of this thing, and he insisted on two things. First, like I said, the original house just had to be part of this luxury villa.
Weird.
Secondly, the whole building had to be designed around this, a gigantic window. The world's largest retractable window, 25 feet high, 15 feet wide, which could be lowered into the wall using electric motors, which was, I guess, a technological marvel in those days. As they say, when a German is autistic, how can you tell? Whatever you thought of the exterior of the building, with this gigantic window, the view from inside was used in a lot of propaganda, not just for the Nazi Party, but for the company that built the window.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
This building is where Hitler received guests such as the recently abdicated Edward VIII, Neville Chamberlain, and David Lloyd George. World history would have gone so differently if Britain still had a pro-German king in the late 30s.
Yeah.
We'd still have an empire.
Yeah.
Certain ethno-religious groups might have had a worse time, but certain ethno-religious groups are having a terrible time nowadays. So you win some, you lose some.
Sorry, Modi.
We can discuss fine art all day long, but at some point, painting and sculpture are an academic exercise, especially to the masses who don't really spend any time in museums. It does become a bigger question when mass media starts to become possible, enabling mass propaganda. This point in history, the 1930s, it's still too early for television, but an epic battle painting can be reprinted and put on a textbook seen in every classroom. This is when you start getting the distinction between the artist and the illustrator, for example.
This is we're really lucky that Hitler never got anywhere near TV, really.
Yeah.
For example, when he was negotiating with Neville Chamberlain, if he felt things weren't going his way, he would stand up and he would say, "You are treating the Germans like ninjas." and walk off. He didn't say ninja.
No.
He didn't, but he'd do that and walk. Can you imagine? That's like I could see Trump doing that.
Yeah.
That would translate like
Apparently, Lyndon Johnson would whip out his balls.
at his penis.
Yeah.
You want to know why? That's why. I'm gonna introduce you to Jumbo.
Yeah, Freddie the Fishmonger may go his entire life without ever seeing a Picasso or a Rembrandt or the inside of a museum at all. And even if he does, it's not going to affect his life. Architecture, on the other hand, is a different question. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Italians still walked among the ruins and remnants of the Roman Empire. The aqueducts survived a long time after people forgot how plumbing worked. Here in our hometown of Toronto, let's take a look at the old and new City Hall, for example.
Okay, so the one on the right is a beautiful building with a timeless quality. The one on the left was literally used in Star Trek as something aliens might build. It's just they just unironically showed that building as like a footage of an alien city.
Yeah.
It got blown up in the Resident Evil movies.
No, I think that was Robart's Library. Same shit.
No, it was
that one, okay.
It was 100% new City Hall because I remember I was really happy. I was like, "Go zombies! Take down that horrible architecture."
Yeah, so the old City Hall came from a time when the city was called Toronto the Good or the Protestant Rome.
Yeah, Toronto used to be a really nice city. The Yankees would come up here and be like, "Where's the homeless?" And we'd be like, "We don't really have those."
Toronto was also the model of an ethnically homogeneous city, which is very different than now.
And people would come up and be like, "You don't have any ninjas," and we'd be like, "Oh, we'd be fine with ninjas." Well,
cue the Curb Your Enthusiasm theme song. Yeah, the new City Hall, on the other hand, the one on the left, this was a product of the 1950s at the dawn of the American century, when you would ingratiate yourself to Washington and New York by demonstrating, you could go along with every horrible idea coming out of the American intelligentsia.
And we do.
Yep. And this architecture was definitely a horrible idea coming out of the American intelligentsia. This was supposed to be the dawn of the utopian concrete metropolis, the futuristic city. But even at the time, Frank Lloyd Wright, in Authority if there ever was one, Frank Lloyd Wright said that it looked like a gravestone and that it marked, quote, the spot where Toronto fell.
Yeah, okay. Okay. I now know where Toronto fell. That's perfect.
Yeah. And proving that Canada was once a proper country, one of our local politicians said that it looked like a Mexican hotel.
Those were the days.
But you cannot get between an intellectual and a bad idea. That's just not possible.
Kurt Vonnegut said humans have no immunity to bad ideas, and that was our grand tragedy as a species.
And that includes our intellectuals.
Yep.
It's especially our intellectuals in
some
ways.
But once they're harder to convince of something in my experience, but once they're convinced of something, good luck dissuading them.
Yeah, the selection committee said this design had, quote, monumental qualities of a great order, a, quote, distinctive and dramatic shape, and that it was set apart from other buildings. You know that people don't believe their own bullshit when they lead with, it's definitely different.
It's unique. It's just...
But the fine denizens of Toronto have to live with this eyesore.
If you told me that the freaking Heaven's Gate guys built this, I would believe you. It looks like something that a horrible cult built to like lure UFOs back to Earth. Like,
I think one of the critics at the time said that it looked like two sewer pipes.
Yeah. Yeah, this looks like PVC. This looks like some ugly pipe with...
Yeah, supposedly it was hopeful and utopian at one point, but, it was built at the same time that the Jetsons was on the air. I do not get the Jetsons vibe from this.
No. It looked like the kind of thing that makes you say, how many grown-ups agreed to do this with our tax money? Like,
yeah. Well, going back to our storyline of the 1930s, Both Hitler and Stalin referred to themselves as the architect of a new society. Both men were adherents of the 19th century cult of progress. That's an entire different discussion, but the entire history of the 19th century is looking at industrialization and saying progress must be inevitable.
Yeah, that's a you don't if you see a graph going up, you can't just continue and assume the graph's going to go up forever. That's just
Unfortunately, like our entire political system, our entire economic system, everything is based on that assumption.
yep. Things will continue to find efficiencies.
And it worked just fine until we put a man on the moon, and then what?
We're almost back to doing that, I guess, but we went around the moon recently.
Yeah, even as recently as the 1930s, the records are sparse enough that we have to piece together stories. But we can be pretty sure of Hitler's recorded involvement in every major architecture project in the Third Reich because he insisted he was involved with it.
He did meth to make sure he could be involved with all of them.
Yeah, he would lay cornerstones of new buildings. He would give speeches about the role of architecture in the health of the Volk. Stalin, on the other hand, is a little harder to pin down because, for a guy as influential as Stalin, it's surprising how little we actually know about him.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, any major architectural undertaking in Moscow required Comrade Stalin to at least put his signature on the design. He claimed to be involved in all of them, but Stalin was a bullshitter.
Yeah. It's the guy who changed his name to Man of Steel. Like,
in our last episode, we mentioned the Palace of Soviets, which never ended up getting built. Yeah, this is not exactly a sign of modesty.
This looks like a horrible totalitarian birthday cake.
Which is basically what it was.
Eh.
All the ideology about egalitarianism and equality. I don't see a lot of equality here.
No, this reminds me of I guess this is what inspired the all the statues of the Kims.
Yeah,
in
probably.
North Korea. They do that same kind of stance. Like Zeph from Cochrane.
Now, Stalin said he was involved in a hands-on way in the planning of this thing. Was he? Who the fuck knows? There is a story, probably apocryphal, about this building here, the Moscow Hotel.
Is this where Trump watched the girls pee on each other?
Who knows?
Probably.
These days, it's actually a Four Seasons of all things.
Oh, Canadian rep. Go Canada.
Now, Soviet architecture was known for being ordered and rational and geometric, but there's one thing you might notice about this building, which is that the two wings look completely different.
Yeah. That's something off-putting. Yeah, that's hurts my eyes. As like Hunter S. Thompson's gonna walk in here with the freaking Samoan.
As the legend goes, and who knows if this is true or not, architect Alexei Shusov drew plans with two different options for the wings and submitted it to Stalin asking for his preference. Stalin was so busy that he just signed the document and sent it back with his approval. And, you would end up in the gulag if you disobeyed Stalin. So what could you do but proceed with the plans?
Yeah, that's.
As the saying goes, if this story wasn't true, it was so on the nose that it would have to be invented.
Yeah.
Who knows why this building is asymmetric, but it's plausible.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying it's plausible.
100% could have happened.
As a quick review, the battle for architecture started in the 1920s. We did a bunch of 1920s episodes where we talked about constructivists, the De Style movement, Bauhaus, and Le Corbusier. And they all had different variations on the concrete cube.
Oh, God.
It was all about efficiency, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with efficiency. If there's a housing crisis, you've got to build stuff, but don't pretend this is art.
Yeah.
Don't pretend this is on par with the pyramids or the cathedrals. But 20th century academics, especially in the field of architecture, they love talking about this stuff like it's the next step in human progress. It's this, then it's Star Trek.
What a waste of freaking energy.
In both Germany and the Soviet Union, there was a counter movement against modernist architecture in the 1920s. In Germany, there were two groups of revolutionary radicals, not just the communists, there was the Brown Team as well. Much has been said about communist subversion of the arts in Weimar Germany, but the Nazis had the Kampfbund für Deutsche Kultur, or the Fighting League for German Culture. I'm sure I should have said that more angrily. I don't speak German. Everything is a long word that you have to say with a certain rage behind your voice.
Well, that's like the Bavarian, or sorry, that's the Berliners.
Yeah.
The Bavarians are like sound like freaking Arnold.
Yeah.
So it all depends on which German accent.
Die Kampfbund für Deutsche Kultur.
The Kampfbund für Deutsche Kultur.
Yeah.
Somewhere between that.
Yeah. So this was the Fighting League for German Culture, which was on the side of the National Socialists. They would fight to have Bolshevik and modernist art removed from local museums. The Red Team, on the other hand, had Bauhaus, which we spent a whole episode talking about. But the Brown Team had an offshoot of the Kampfbund, which focused on architecture, and they argued that architecture needed to be based on heritage in service of the people and the state. Very German. In Russia, the constructivists, the one on the top left is constructivist architecture. The constructivists were the face of the avant-garde and official culture of the first few years of the 1920s. Then the Civil War ended, and Lenin had to actually pay off the debt that he ran up.
Oh, this is always a bad moment for communists.
Yeah, so he had to revive the private sector via the quasi-capitalist new economic policy. And that meant that there was once again going to be a class of people who had disposable income, and they wanted to spend it on proper art and proper architecture, so the constructivists just disappeared.
Important.
The disappearance of constructivism is often blamed on Stalin coming to power in 1924, but it was disappearing when Lenin was still alive. During the second half of the 1920s, the All-Russian Organization of Proletarian Architects were more traditionalist. They directed their campaigns against modernist architecture, cubes, flat roofs, etc. Why would you have flat roofs in Siberia, in Russia?
Great question. Because you want to make sure that the peasants have to go up and shovel their roofs, which they actually do have to do. Otherwise, enough snow builds up that it collapses the structure. Also, like, you mean people don't want to live in concrete cubes if they have an option?
Yeah.
It's shit. I'm going to think about this later in my concrete cube.
Since when did Russian communists ever care about what the people wanted?
We are hungry. I don't care.
So if you starve, you will no longer be hungry.
This is
Win-win.
Yeah. These are the people during the Holodomor that used to like burst into your farm and be like, "How come no one's died in your family? You must be hiding food."
So as much as we think of Soviet housing as being depressing concrete cubes, at least in the 1920s, there was a vocal contingent in the Soviet Union describing concrete cube housing as a capitalist attempt to herd the proletariat. For a few years in the Soviet Union, there were differing voices, differing opinions. That was sorted out fairly quickly in the 1930s.
You will have cube and like it, comrade.
So in both countries, Germany and Russia, there was an argument over culture in general and architecture in specific for most of the 1920s. Last time we talked about how these arguments came to a halt, and in both countries they came to a quick halt. In Russia, one night in 1932, a bunch of Russian writers got a mysterious phone call telling them to drop everything and go to a dark street corner to await further instructions. Like something out of a spy movie. I'm sure they thought the Gulag awaited.
Yeah, this is how, if you haven't read Gulag Archipelago, this is one of the ways they sent you to the Gulag. Another way they sent you to the Gulag is to tell you you were going on vacation.
So they all eventually ended up at the apartment of Maxim Gorky, where Stalin was in attendance, saying that from now on, comrades, all writers' guilds will be abolished, and the only culture allowed is going to be socialist realism. Of course, socialist realism wasn't defined. Just everybody knew that if they didn't get with the program, whatever the program was, they were in deep shit. There was not going to be any cultural dissent allowed anymore.
Nope.
That's for the West.
Yep.
Socialist realism was defined in 1934 at the Soviet Writers' Congress when this man was put in charge of it, um, Alexei Zhdanov. Sorry, Andrei Zhdanov. Uh, he would make you disappear if your writing or your other art wasn't on point.
Jeez.
This is when the Soviet Union started to become the Soviet Union.
Yeah, like a fat bureaucrat can tell you, off to Gulag. Art's not good enough.
Like every student group I was in when I was in university had a guy that looked like this.
Yep. The Beetlemen. Orwell talked about. Orwell said that in a bureaucracy like this, especially a soulless one, the only people who get promoted are people who are not threatening.
Yep.
So you
And
end
that
up
was
with
this guy.
yeah, so you end up with these Beetlemen just proliferating everywhere like roaches. This is classic Beetleman.
Yeah, we talked a little more about this guy last time. I'm not going to repeat everything. You can go watch that episode if you need to. But when this guy was put in charge of socialist realism, a large part of it was going to be the cult of Stalin. Again, the Soviet Union became the Soviet Union.
The Harvey Weinstein of communism.
Now, in Germany, the transition was a lot more abrupt because in 1933, Hitler came to power. He became chancellor, and he decreed from day one, from on high, that modernism is no longer acceptable.
No more of that.
So, in both Russia and Germany, all artistic battles between modernism and traditionalism were just put to rest, and that included disputes between modernist architecture and proper architecture. I use the word proper somewhat facetiously, of course, since I think most modernist architecture is hideous. But I understand that you can only fight technological progress so much, and a steel factory is not going to have a neoclassical or Art Deco look to it. When you're trying to run an economy that keeps people employed, the industrial sector depends on efficiency, and you can't get between a German engineer and the pursuit of efficiency. That's just never going to happen. So there was still a place for utilitarian architecture, but there was going to be a firm dividing line between the ideological architecture meant for important buildings and the utilitarian stuff meant for the factories.
Rule for Gopnik, not for me.
More importantly, there were not going to be any exhibits like the Museum of Modern Art's 1932 International Exhibition of Modern Architecture, which actually espoused the beauty of the concrete worker housing cube as the enlightened way of the future. Go back and watch the last 25 minutes of our final 1920s episode if you don't know what I'm talking about, because that really did happen, and it really did become the foundation of the ugly architecture of the American century. In From Bauhaus to Our House, Tom Wolfe wrote that there has never been a more dominant global cultural hegemon than the United States of the second half of the 20th century, and the only architecture they left behind is this.
Oh, God.
This is the Boston Government Service Center.
Isn't it? It's hard enough going to like deal with like the DMV or whatever. You got to make it look like this, really.
And this was built before the Civil Rights Act. This was built before Shaniqua was going here every day to give you an attitude.
Again, looks like a fortification. It's like something I would build to like make the drone operator not be sure exactly where my fire team was. Like,
at least in the 1930s, in both the Third Reich and in Stalinist Russia, there was not going to be any of this nonsense. If Stalin shoved you into a depressing gray housing block, it was because he viewed you as garbage and was open about it. He was not going to bullshit you about this being a utopian aesthetic.
It's the silver lining of communism.
As far as Soviet administrative buildings went, there was a period of transition between the modernist stuff and the aesthetically pleasing ideological stuff. Uh, and as late as 1936, our old friend Le Corbusier was able to win a competition to design the Ministry of Light Industry in Moscow. And it looks exactly the way you would expect a Soviet building designed by Le Corbusier to look.
Oh God, he somehow in the depressing landscape, in the depressing architecture, he did this is particularly depressing. This is like where Charlie Puckett and his family lives. It's like their tenement.
Well,
Like,
look at that thing on the left. That looks like a science fair model of a spaceship made out of a Folgers can and
yeah,
popsicle sticks.
yeah. If you told me a child made this, and I love how they're all living next to like a smokestack thing. Like that's just like.
But that's not the best part of this. The best part of this is that Le Corbusier designed this assuming it was going to be on a curved street, and that curved street was never built, so this is pointing the wrong way.
Oh God, Jesus! Oh my God!
Remember, every architect who went to university in the mid 20th century worships Le Corbusier.
Yeah, this is what if you went to Mick University, this is what Mick University looks like. This is like, any extension built to like a public university. This is where you go to class. This is where you go to learn about calculus. There's a miserable building like that. And then in Canada, it was determined that the windows were inefficient because of winter, so they bricked up most of the windows.
Yep.
So you get these hideous buildings that are bricked up windows. Like it's anyway. Fuck
Yep.
you, Corbusier.
And today we're looking at the genesis of this,
The
the foundation,
The locus.
the brilliant minds of the early 20th century who gave us this stuff. The center of modernist architecture in Germany was Bauhaus. In the 9th episode of this series, we talked about Weimar Germany, and most of that episode was about Bauhaus, so I'm not going to rehash all of it. But shortly after Hitler came to power, the Bauhaus staff showed up one day and discovered that the doors had all been padlocked, and that was that.
Lockout. These were the guys who inspired the nihilists in the Big Lebowski.
The Third Reich was not the Soviet Union, where they got rid of all the old organizations and started from scratch. Every cultural union in Germany was just going to be brought under the purview of Joseph Goebbels' Chamber of Culture, and it was going to be illegal to do any cultural work outside the official channels. There were some early Nazis who were modern artists, and they thought that, all right, now that we've taken power, at least Hitler will make an exception for me, right? 9!
Sorry, boys.
We ended the last episode talking about the degenerate art exhibition. Some of those people were Nazis, to be very clear. And they were told, if you want to remain a Nazi, you are not going to be allowed to pick up a paintbrush ever again.
Sorry, boys. You backed the wrong horse.
I mean, I think they were believers in the ideology, but it just wasn't going to be a wise career move for them.
Not for them.
To be fair, joining the Third Reich was maybe a good career move if you were a failed creative. So
it's very
6.5 a dozen.
Very politic. Very politic. And I guess it was like the grinder of the freaking Third Reich.
Well, we also can't forget the Führerprinzip, or the principles of the Führer, which said that the word of Hitler superseded any law. So any practicing architects were not going to be doing any modernism unless they left the country.
No, sir.
Whether or not the law said they were allowed to do this concrete stuff, it didn't matter. Hitler said they weren't.
Yeah.
It's efficient.
Yeah. There's advantages to this kind of thing, but there's disadvantages. If you want to see the disadvantages, Google Barbarossa.
Yeah. But alas, like Puritanism, European ideas don't get stamped out when they're terrible. They just move to America. In our first Paris episode, which is the 10th episode of this series, we talked about the lost generation, the generation of Ernest Hemingway, James Joyce, and because we're stuck in a 100-year cultural auto loop, the sexually deviant crowd at Natalie Clifford Barney's Paris salons, which looked eerily like a Seattle gaggle of lesbians from the Katie Lang era.
It's
Like,
an
go
old,
back, watch that episode. These look like 90s Seattle lesbians.
it's an older trope than I thought.
In the 19th century, the de facto official American history of arts and letters consisted of domestic names like Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry David Thoreau. There were a few names like Henry James and James McNeill Whistler who spent most of their lives in Europe as expats, hobnobbing with the European aristocrats. In the case of John Singer Sargent, he was even born abroad and he only ever made a couple of short visits to America. But he was considered the face of American art. The United States was just another country, and American was just an ethnicity. Uh, but it was,
A very particular ethnicity.
but it was also an ethnicity with an inferiority complex about European culture. Uh, in many ways, this was unjustified self-loathing because the Europeans viewed America as a pioneering nation in literature, at least since Walt Whitman. But when Europe was bombed out during World War I and their currency was in the toilet, every young American creative was able to get the European experience at a discount, and a lot of them jumped at the chance to feel sophisticated. Certain creatives like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ezra Pound were already established when they moved to Paris, but the first American expat to truly rise from obscurity to cultural significance was Ernest Hemingway when The Sun Also Rises was published. That book contained an epigraph about a French mechanic saying that the American expats were all a lost generation, and thus this group of trust fund bohemians in Paris was forever given a moniker.
Oh.
That was the young American writers of the Lost Generation. But if a young American architect of the Lost Generation went to Europe in the 1920s, the Bauhaus was one of the jewels of European sophistication, especially because modernism had come into vogue as everyone wanted to put the war behind them. And the stereotypical Bauhaus student became the template of every insufferable fine arts student to this day.
As the beret wearing,
Yep.
black clad, smoking, weird little glasses, weirdos. All right.
Yeah, weird haircuts. Bauhaus faculty were into weird spirituality cults and vegetarian diets.
Oh, like now.
Like I said, it goes right back to Bauhaus. This was the template for the art school student who has a weird sexuality, a weird haircut, and thinks he or she or they or Z is original. You're not original.
Hitler's vegetarianism makes a lot more sense with this in mind. It was in vogue.
One instructor at Bauhaus, Johannes Itten, preached colonic irrigation because every cult, spiritual or secular, always seems to end up with colonic irrigation.
Yeah, Gandhi did that to people.
We did a whole episode. It was a long episode as well. Go back and watch that if you want the full deep dive into Bauhaus. The important thing is that the founder and first head of Bauhaus was this man, Walter Gropius.
He looks like the bad guy in that Rodney Dangerfield going back to school.
That movie's a classic.
That's great. Great flick.
Gropius was born into money, but not an aristocratic family. But that did not stop the Americans from viewing him as the paragon of European aristocratic sophistication.
Jesus.
Nobody seemed to notice or care that all of his buildings looked rather utilitarian, uninspiring. Like, look at this.
Oh, that's bad.
At least in the field of architecture, this guy and Le Corbusier were the American avatars of European sophistication for the new world where new construction materials make new designs possible. But some of the serious American tastemakers never seemed to stop and ask if concrete slabs were aesthetically pleasing.
Dogs like to pee on them.
Now, there were skeptics. Washington, D.C.'s supervising architect, James Wetmore, and later Louis Simon, they insisted that the administrative buildings in Washington, D.C. had to remain in traditional or classical styles. perhaps with a little bit of Art Deco influence in the New Deal era. They saw full well how ugly a gray block of reinforced concrete is. Unfortunately, they were going to be outnumbered.
Mm.
To be fair, if you go to Tel Aviv or the parts of Florida that were built up in the 60s, often by a similar demographic, uh, entire towns and neighborhoods were built from the ground up using this kind of architecture, and it does seem to work somewhat coherently.
Well, I guess if you got to worry about hurricanes, it makes sense.
Well, this is Tel Aviv. They call
Oh,
it the
okay.
White
You got to
City.
worry about other things. Tel Aviv in your roof.
They call it the White City, which I'm sure certain groups in Middle America might not appreciate.
Let's not tell the protester kids that.
But I will admit that this looks somewhat coherent when you build the entire city. Let's say out of the desert. Some people might disagree with the idea that there was nothing here before, but
There were lizards.
but when you look at a brutalist monstrosity like Toronto City Hall, built on a beautiful pre-existing city, that shit is terrible and it's unforgivable.
Mm.
Probably the most egregious example of this is the Tour Montparnasse, which led Paris to put a complete moratorium on modernist architecture.
Oh, that's ugly. So yeah, you talk about the Tower of Mordor. Jesus.
Wait, you know what building I'm talking about when I ask you what building's the modernist one here? We mentioned how the 19th century had the cult of progress, which pervaded most academic narratives at the time, from Napoleon to Karl Marx to Darwin to Spencer to Bismarck to Edward Bellamy's utopian novel, which became the basis of Star Trek. We've spoken about that in a few of our past episodes. Early 20th century politics was replete with true believers who really did believe their theories were the next step in, and sometimes the culminating step of, the 19th century narrative of progress. In America, a group called the Progressives took over a significant faction of both the Democrats and the Republicans, both major parties. Herbert Crowley's The Promise of American Life is often considered the Progressives' manifesto, which got people on board with the idea of big corporations working hand in hand with the government. Crowley explicitly says that America has a second chance at the French Revolution. Guys, no, don't. Some people like to think of Americans being stupid. Americans are not stupid. It's the smart Americans I'm worried about. Because smart Americans, you want to talk about people having no immunity to a bad idea.
Yeah, once they're on board, it's that old fundamentalist religious streak in them. Once the American ruling class is on board with something, it's just they're going to go all out.
Yeah. The cult of progress is the dominant ethos that pervades the writings of all but a few dissidents and will pervade the dominant ethos until Neil Armstrong walked on the moon and people expected there to be another big thing coming after space travel, and it just never came.
In fact, we forgot how to go to the moon.
Yeah. We had commercial supersonic flight when we were kids.
Yep.
It was possible to get on the Concorde in London, fly to New York, and have the flight be so fast that you actually didn't go back in time, but you went back a couple of time zones.
Took 2 hours. 2 hours from London or Paris to New York.
We don't have that anymore.
Oh, blew up.
We can barely even keep track of how many genders there are.
What are those things, Father? Oh, those were the aqueducts, son.
Now, every cult needs a satanic figure, and the Emmanuel Goldstein of the cult of progress is the bourgeoisie.
Ooh, I've heard about these guys.
Well, the word bourgeois never seems to be all that well defined, especially as an adjective.
It's anyone who has more money than you, basically, seems to be how it's defined.
Well, I've met a lot of rich people who love to look down on the middle class for being bourgeois.
That's fair.
They like to pretend they're going after the privileged. At least they want to make themselves feel good.
Mm.
They want to justify their third grade teacher who called them gifted.
Ooh, that's a hard thing to live down for some of these people.
Yeah, intellectual and artistic types love to attack their rivals by saying their rivals' ideas or works are bourgeois. Meaningless words are critical to sophistry because the staff at Bauhaus could always say, sure, our stuff is minimalist, ugly, and uninspiring, but it's not bourgeois. Now, this was a double edged sword because Hitler was every bit as much of an adherent of the cult of progress. Hitler viewed himself as the capstone on a process that had really started in antiquity.
Yeah, that's why it's the Third Reich.
Yeah, Hitler just said, I'm going to put the kibosh on all this Bauhaus shit right now by calling it bourgeois. And he did. Once you start justifying tearing things down, you really can't get that toothpaste back in the tube. You want to call your ancestors evil or unsophisticated and then be remembered as the visionary on the right side of history. If you're lucky, you won't be remembered at all when another group uses the same justification to tear down your work.
Mm.
And as World War II fades farther into history, we're starting to relitigate a lot of narrative questions about the war. And part of that is viewing Hitler as just any other historical figure instead of the embodiment of all that is evil. But as a believer in the cult of progress, Hitler was the ultimate victim of the pattern of saying everything up to this point is the before times and the future starts now, only to be cast as the villain within a matter of decades.
Yeah, like they dug up freaking Cromwell.
Yep.
Like, well, Cromwell wasn't pure enough. Jeez,
Well,
it's just what they do.
in Orwell's late writings, I mean, Orwell didn't live that long after World War II, but Orwell didn't talk about Hitler as the embodiment of all evil. He talked about Hitler as the idiot who decided to invade Russia.
Yep, he's unimpressive. That's truly, you look at Hitler's story, you kind of examine what's left of the record.
Yep.
Yeah, an unimpressive little miserable freaking arts kid.
Yeah, as World War II fades into history, as that generation dies and the current generation is not taught anything about history, Hitler is just going to be another name on the list of German chancellors.
Yep.
The only difference between now and then is that the word fascist seems to have replaced bourgeois as the empty insult of choice for your political enemies. But we're playing the exact same games now that we were 100 years ago.
100%.
Going back to the young American architects who spent a few years fucking around Europe, they saw this hideous modernist architecture and they romanticized it a little bit too much. They expected to go back to America and start building quaint New England vacation houses, which just lacked the sophistication of a European reinforced concrete cube. And to be very clear, that was only ever used in Europe for a few government contracts for workers' housing compounds.
Wow.
But you can't hold back a bad idea, especially in America.
Nope.
In 1929, all the concrete cube architects were given a miracle courtesy of the Rockefeller family, the Museum of Modern Art. Europeans started seriously collecting modern art in the 1920s. And when I say modern, I mean going back about as far as Van Gogh. There were a handful of eccentric rich collectors like Sergei Shukin who would buy the work of Matisse and Picasso. But for the most part, that market consisted of the exact same nouveau riche bourgeois types that the bohemians consistently decried. You're scum, buy my art.
Yeah.
Partially due to World War I and partially because of the auction of the gigantic collection of John Quinn, who died in 1924 after being a major patron of modern art, there was a taste for something new and different, and it kind of started when they auctioned off his collection. Orwell wrote that American kids would go to Europe for a few years and come back unsure if they wanted to be fascist or communist, but they were always steadfastly convinced that the American government was doing things the wrong way. Americans have always had an inferiority complex when it comes to European sophistication or what they think is European sophistication.
Yeah, it's the same with the Russians. It's one thing they have in common with their great enemy.
Well, this matters to our story because when an American rich kid backpacks around Europe for a few years, usually all that happens is that he or she comes back insufferable.
Yeah, it happened to me.
But when the Rockefellers and their friends spent their time on the French Riviera, they came back with the exact same fetishization of European culture, and that's where it becomes a problem.
These people freaking make decisions.
Yep. John D. Rockefeller's wife, Abigail, decided that she just needed to grace her countrymen with the refinement of a Picasso painting of a bright green woman with both tits on the same side of her body, or a concrete housing block for factory workers. I spent most of my 20s living in the northeastern United States. There is a certain type of American coastal elite who is well meaning and hardworking, but who honestly believes that the sky is yellow and has an unshakable self assuredness about it. Abby Rockefeller is exactly that kind of American. If she were alive today, she would be hanging out with Lena Dunham and transing her kids.
Oh, God. I don't even want to Google what Lena Dunham's up to these days. It's going to be horrible. I know it's going to be deeply. Holy shit.
Yeah, this is Abby Rockefeller. She was born in the 1870s. She looks exactly like the student you'd see at Oberlin College or some of these places.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Classmate of Margaret Atwood's.
Yeah, so the Museum of Modern Art was founded by the Rockefellers in the company of a who's who of American industrialists and old money. And it was this woman's brainchild. Two of her sons later became its president, Nelson Rockefeller in 1939 and David Rockefeller in 1958, both of whom referred to MoMA as Mommy's Museum.
Jeez.
Now, this is where the story takes a bit of an unexpected turn, because every conspiracy theorist who has listened to Alex Jones for any amount of time has heard of both of those guys.
Yep.
David Rockefeller lived a secretive life, but he was also the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, the secretive organization at the center of every conspiracy theory about the New World Order. He was also the man who brought Henry Kissinger into the fold.
Oh, wow.
David Rockefeller has often been called the original George Soros because he would throw money at the organizations behind any progressive initiative.
Well, George Soros freaking wishes he was freaking Rockefeller.
Yeah. Well, especially those organizations and initiatives which couldn't be legislated. That's when Rockefeller money came in.
Interesting that. Now, for anybody who's like off put by this, they do good things, they do bad things, but there's, to really talk about power in the States, you got to talk about some of these some of these things that became public foundations or that had a lot of influence. They do things like, funding crappy social movements, and they do things like teaching Indians how to feed themselves.
Well, so for as much as the Americans have this mythos about leaving the aristocracy and the king behind them, the Rockefeller family were, for all intents and purposes, aristocrats. They viewed themselves as stewards of the country. And quite frankly, since the Rockefellers have lost social status, the country's been falling apart.
They need a king. Yeah. The Yankees are still, at the end of the day, culturally British in a lot of ways. And they need a king.
Also, at the end of the day, the country was just most functional when it was most corrupt. I don't want to say that, but it's true.
Another thing they have in common with the Russians.
Nelson Rockefeller, the other Rockefeller kid who was president of MoMA, he was a serious player in mid-century politics, first as the Republican governor of New York in the 50s and 60s, and then as Gerald Ford's vice president, where Kissinger was the Secretary of State. But more importantly, Nelson Rockefeller was a major player in the CIA's covert propaganda operations in the 1950s, and the Museum of Modern Art was a major node in that propaganda network. So MoMA is not just some vanity project of a family of insufferable socialites. We are now running into names that have no business being part of this story. How the fuck are we talking about Henry Kissinger?
Yeah, they were still trotting him out when I was a kid, when I was younger. They still trotting him out.
Yeah,
Anytime there was a major issue, he's
he
just
he
one of these guys they couldn't get rid of.
he just died a couple years ago, but he was being trotted out to talk about the current Ukrainian war.
Yep. And he also, one of the last things he said was that multiculturalism had been a failure.
Yeah, that he did. Yeah. We've ended up 1 degree removed from the shadowy council that sent Henry Kissinger to China. Something's wrong here.
Yeah. We're supposed to be figuring out why art's ugly.
Yeah. Every conspiracy theorist can tell you about the shenanigans of the CIA. Now, it's not accurate to say that the CIA was running a massive operation to brainwash everybody, although Ted Kaczynski wasn't completely wrong about everything either.
Okay. CIA Ted Kaczynski tie-in. The CIA paid a professor to spend hours with Ted Kaczynski abusing and making fun of him.
Yep.
Like hours and hours.
Kaczynski also sent a bomb to a guy who turned up on Epstein's Island.
Yep. Yep.
I'm not saying believe everything Kaczynski said. I'm just saying don't necessarily disbelieve it either.
It's funny what ends up being true when you check. Is the CIA running the world? No,
Yeah.
absolutely not. The CIA can't do anything. It's another incompetent government organization, but
Well,
they're out there doing stuff.
that's what I'm saying. It is true that the CIA maintained the infrastructure that was used to deliver post-war propaganda to Europe, especially to Germany. So if you dig deep enough into any subversive propaganda since 1945, you will often find the fingerprints of the CIA and the Rockefeller family. But, if you dig deep enough into any piece of software, you'll find the fingerprints of Microsoft and Google. Like, the Museum of Modern Art was certainly part of that infrastructure, and they're the ones who wrote the narrative where Michelangelo, Picasso, and Pollock are steps in one logical progression. This narrative was passed to the expanded university system in the 60s and 70s, where every middle class boomer learned art history. But, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm just saying somehow Henry Kissinger has been tied into this story.
He's a guy, he's always there. No one can tell you why. He's just tied into this.
Yeah. So we're looking at the 1930s when MoMA had just been opened. And the narrative loves to talk about American art being backwards and academic in the early 20th century until people's eyes were opened by the Armory Show in 1913 and Marcel Duchamp submitting a urinal to an art gallery in 1917. We've already spent one entire episode debunking both of those claims. I'm not going to repeat it here. That was our first Paris episode. In reality, modernism was introduced to America in the 1930s by this large corporate institution, the Museum of Modern Art, literally run by the Rockefeller family. The prestige art galleries of the day didn't always appreciate modernism, but that really didn't matter because every corporation in America really wanted to ingratiate itself to the Rockefeller family. And one way you could do that is by using modern art in your advertising.
Oh, okay.
And that they did. For example, the Container Corporation of America started using illustrations by Fernand Léger. Like, this is advertising.
Okay, all right.
So does it really matter what the museums think when all of corporate America is doing this?
So like now with the when Gillette did
Yes.
or all of them did hey, let's put transsexuals and tell all that stuff on our art. They put the just first day transsexual on the Bud can.
Oh yeah, yeah.
It was his first day being into this, and they're like, oh, you're ready for the Bud can. But yeah, that makes sense. Okay, just all right. So you get grants from these freaking foundations if you do this. All right.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. From the second that MoMA opened, modernism was a corporate institutional standard. Maybe not a cultural standard, but a corporate standard. And, so it goes in the 20th century. As corporate America goes, the world goes. There was nothing organic about this. The people who wrote the narrative conveniently leave themselves out of the narrative. They leave the importance of the Museum of Modern Art out of the narrative, and they leave out the fact that they were the ones who pushed it on America by way of the corporations.
I just want to take a moment to point out these are not Jews.
No?
These are wasps. This is the wasp family that figured out you could power the world with oil.
Yep.
So anyway,
Now
it's not always them, is what I'm saying.
there are certainly a lot of them in their orbit, but that's a different story. No, this is the wasps.
Yep. This is the wasp money. This is the wasp mafia.
Arshil Gorky, who is best remembered as one of the abstract expressionists, he complained that MoMA only showcased European artists in the 30s, though that would soon change in the 40s with the rise of Jackson Pollock. You think the cultural history of the 30s is being airbrushed out. Wait till we get to the cultural history of the 40s.
Oh wow.
But Gorky also needed to put food on the table, so he went along with it. He was employed by the Federal Art Project, which we talked about a couple episodes ago, and he did this mural at Newark Airport.
Oh, this is like that communist one with the
Yep.
with the triangle. Oh God.
This is called Flight, and I don't think Arshil Gorky's heart was ever in this stuff, but working artists are whores at the best of times.
Oh my God.
Yeah, in 1932, MoMA held the aforementioned International Exhibition of Modern Architecture, which was a true showcase of bland architecture with no paint, no ornamentation, and a lot of right angles. We showed this slide a few episodes ago. If you have been paying attention to our whole series, especially our Bauhaus episode, you can probably look at some of those pictures in the background and recognize those buildings and those architects. In fact, some of those pictures probably were in that episode.
Okay.
And I'm not going to rehash it. We've already gone through this, but the catalog for this event was later published under the title The International Style. Museum copy is not something that should ever be taken as serious scholarship, but the early days of the Museum of Modern Art can be described as institutional capture of American aesthetics. And the catalog, co-authored by a young Philip Johnson, starts with the claim that Gothic architecture was the last time an architectural revolution was sparked by the availability of a new building material. And now, with the advent of reinforced concrete, architecture is on the precipice of the next great revolution. Not making this up.
Jesus God.
I wish I were making this up. I went back and read the actual catalog. I go back and read the primary sources when I do this stuff. I wish I were exaggerating by saying that. I'm not.
Your future is concrete.
Yeah, the 19th century had Victorian architecture, which is worthless because it's all just an imitation of a prior style. Then the 1880s saw the development of the skyscraper, but that just cluttered the skyline with too many vertical lines. Actually, the argument as well.
Jesus.
But now we are on the precipice of the next big revolution. And what was the evidence of this impending revolution? This.
Oh, that's soulless. That looks like
It's worker housing. It's all worker housing.
I was gonna say it looks like a warehouse.
The artists who they mentioned were J.J.P. Oud, Le Corbusier, Gropius, and Mies van der Rohe. They were all making modular cubes for worker housing projects, unpainted and designed with so little decoration that they could be mass produced for the lowest dollar amount.
Oh my God.
The museum catalog said Victorian houses and skyscrapers they were building, but this stuff on the screen, this is architecture.
Oh my God. So it's like when everybody praised the transsexual and the
Yep.
okay. All right. Okay. It's like that
I'm
for
not
ugly
making it up.
architecture.
I'm not making it up. This is the actual argument. Now there's a new material available, so now this is a revolution.
Oh my God. I mean, yeah, you look at what with the transgendered movement, the
Yep.
same kind of push. from the same kind of people. And
The people who believe in progress, there was always a new scientific revolution coming
yeah,
along, but when there's no new scientific revolution, you have to create your own progress by discovering new genders.
okay, it's like the religious people in their freaking end of the world.
So, according to the catalog, in the entire 19th century, there were only two examples of real architecture. By real architecture, I mean stuff that made use of the fact that new materials were available. The Crystal Palace and the Eiffel Tower, both of which open to the same, let's say, mixed reception that Toronto's new City Hall opened to.
Mm,
I'm not questioning the engineering feat of the Crystal Palace or the Eiffel Tower, but one was a glorified greenhouse and the other was a glorified antenna.
it's a new kind of welding.
Yeah. Unfortunately, MoMA's 1932 exhibition was going to cast a very long shadow on the next 100 years of architecture. So, going back to our story, the MoMA event happened in February 1932. Hitler came to power in January 1933, and Bauhaus was closed in July of 1933. Gropius,
Priorities.
yeah, well, Walter Gropius had already left Bauhaus a few years earlier. Then, the staff showed up and saw the doors padlocked.
Yeah, lockout.
To this day, historians have different theories about why Gropius left.
He got Gropius?
Yeah.
Did he get Me Too'd?
Again, these were the templates for the modern art student, so there's a non-zero chance.
Yeah, absolutely. No, nobody does perversion like an arts prof.
So especially a German arts prof.
Oh God, can you imagine?
The director of Bauhaus at the end was actually Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. Both Gropius and Mies found themselves immediately out of work, at least if they wanted to continue designing plain concrete cubes. The story is usually told as them both having to flee Hitler. In reality, they both joined Goebbels' Chamber of Culture, at least for a little while, and they both signed documents supporting Hitler.
There we go. They know what side the bread's buttered on.
Yeah, a lot of books say that Gropius and Mies, quote unquote, fled the Third Reich. In reality, they both tried to accommodate Hitler, but neither one of them could get his shitty designs approved for any major commissions in the Third Reich.
It's another one of these glitches in the Matrix.
Yeah.
Is for most of the Third Reich, you could leave and you could come check it out. It was like you go on vacation and go see what's up. There's all these accounts of Americans who went like on Nazi vacations. Like it wasn't like the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union really was locked down and you couldn't travel. But the Hitler felt he could he could trust them not to run away because he was feeding them.
Also, if you weren't an Aryan, he didn't want you there.
Yeah, you had these weird cruises that he sent people on that were very regimented. Like you will have fun now. It is shuffleboard time. Like
I'm not going to pretend Germans don't enjoy that.
Well, that's what the guy said. The guy who wrote Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. He said, I went on one of these cruises and it was, for me, very odd, but all the Germans seemed to be just having a great time.
You have thought of everything.
Yep. Oh, polka time.
Both Mies and Gropius had one good fortune, though, and that's that when MoMA had that really horrible exhibition of modern architecture, they both had been named as visionary architects in the catalog. The catalog that described the sophistication of European concrete cubes. And this happened at exactly the time that the Rockefeller family had just taken over as the kingmakers of taste in corporate America.
So just right place, right time.
Yeah. So these two guys didn't flee Nazi Germany so much as the Americans telegraphed that they were completely easy marks.
Okay. Yeah. Nation of joiners.
Gropius arrived in America in 1937. Mies arrived shortly after. And within a year, Gropius was made chair of the Department of Architecture at Harvard Graduate School of Design.
Remember when you could get an academic posting? Those were the days.
Especially as a white guy.
Oh, yeah, jeez.
Gropius designed a house for himself in Lincoln, Massachusetts, which broke absolutely zero patterns if you've been paying attention to this guy.
Oh yeah,
Look
and,
at
and the
this.
let me guess, the roof leaked.
Oh, that was Corbusier.
No,
That
this
was,
too. I bet the
yeah,
roof
yeah.
leaked. They're always leaking. It makes flat roof, man. I can't unsee it.
Mies van der Rohe, he was likewise hired to head the department at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. So deep is the Americans' fetishization of a European accent that two Germans could show up penniless and immediately head up the architecture departments at two prestigious universities.
Jeez. It's like when the Indians showed up in California and taught everybody yoga.
Yep.
Everybody was like, "Yeah, this is part of Hinduism, right?" And they're like, "Yeah, sure."
And Bikram's a billionaire now.
Wow, of course.
This is why, despite projecting more power than the Roman Empire or the British Empire, the United States is not going to leave behind the Colosseum or the aqueducts.
No.
It's not going to leave behind the great British colonial train stations. It's going to leave behind the Seagram building. Look at this.
Well, what's the other thing? The only other like truly American thing I can think of is that pyramid they built bigger than the Pyramid of Giza. That is a Bass Pro Shop
in Memphis.
Yeah, that's
and Trump Tower.
Yeah, and Trump Tower.
So at Harvard, the nexus of the American ruling class, Gropius came in and said all the old kinds of architecture are finished. Overnight, all of the old world styles that went into the libraries and hotels at the end of America's Gilded Age, they were now seen as antiquated and, more importantly, bourgeois.
Sorry, Art Deco.
Harvard was now going to produce non-bourgeois architecture. And if you've ever wondered why all architecture has been ugly since World War II, it's because that's when the entire global university system became part of a hierarchy with Harvard on top. And therefore, Harvard architecture had to be the trendsetter. But yeah, this is the paradox of Americans. They have a lot of bravado in so many ways, and yet they are completely insecure in a lot of other ways. This is the country that gave the world the skyscraper. And when Art Deco came out of the 1925 Paris Expo, the Americans immediately synthesized it into some of the most awe-inspiring designs, like the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building. And yet, one guy with a German accent, who I reiterate, did not leave the Third Reich because he was oppressed. He left for reasons of opportunism. He was able to convince the entire American elite to throw away its contribution to 20th century architecture and go with this.
It's like that Muslim cleric that outlawed math.
Yep.
It's like one of those moments. Like,
within 5 years, all of the major American architectural theorists all but disappeared from Harvard's publications.
It's like civilizational new money.
Mm-hmm.
Just no idea what to do with it. Just like, oh, let's build something ugly.
Well, when you combine WASP self-loathing with the desire to micromanage everybody else,
and the bureaucracy to do it.
Yep. Well, yeah, when the Americans found themselves in charge of the world in 1945, you just got a lot of truly ugly architecture done in the name of the American perception of European sophistication. Not real European sophistication, just the Americans thought this stuff was European sophistication, and that was good enough.
Oh, yeah. It's like to this day, it's like you'll assume that somebody with a British accent is smarter. Well, depending on the British accent, but
somebody who speaks in received pronunciation. In Britain, that just means you've been to theater school. But yeah, this architecture spread globally, and from the brutalist office building to the glass and steel high-rise, it all stems out of efficient worker housing if you go back far enough. This building here, what is it but really big, efficient worker housing?
What a nightmare. It's like a Borg cube.
Yeah, so the paradox of bravado and insecurity is seen most explicitly with the case of Frank Lloyd Wright. Since the 1880s, he had been the star of American architecture. His ideas were basically the same as what were preached by Gropius and the Bauhaus crew about how we have new building materials, so houses don't necessarily need to look like a thatched cottage in the English countryside. And Frank Lloyd Wright even designed his Usonian houses with the idea that a simple design could be efficiently replicated to house a large group of people. The difference is that Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian houses didn't look like gray cubes. They looked like this. This actually looks nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see like hobbits living here.
I wouldn't think twice about living in these things, but sometimes in life you roll snake eyes. And Frank Lloyd Wright rolled snake eyes more than once. First of all, we spoke in a previous episode about his miscalculation in designing an open concept house where his Caribbean manservant was not cordoned off from his mistress.
We don't need a cage for him.
One day, while Frank Lloyd Wright was away on business, the manservant went crazy, doused the place in gasoline, and lit a match. And then, while the other servants and his family were trying to escape, he killed a bunch of them with a hatchet, including Wright's mistress and two of their children.
You should make a horror movie about that.
I'm not saying you need to keep them in a cage. I'm just saying don't have an open concept house.
Yeah, you gotta have locking doors for your help, man. You don't want them walking around at night.
Yeah, so that was 1914. Then the house burned down again in 1925, this time due to an electrical fire.
Oops.
But none of that was as unfortunate as what happened in 1932 when the MoMA exhibitions catalog said, "We owe a great debt to the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, but he was just a transitional fossil. He was like Moses, getting right up to the promised land of gray concrete cubes, but he never made it." And then in 1937, Walter Gropius showed up in America and was going to rewrite all the rules of American architecture, throwing out everything, including Frank Lloyd Wright, who was now in his 60s, because the way of the future was concrete cubes. Whatever you think of Frank Lloyd Wright, he did not have the entire university system on his side, but Gropius and Mies did.
Like Margaret Atwood.
Yep, exactly. That's not to say there was no difference at all from university to university, just that every university was going to teach a slight variation on the Bauhaus style. That's why wherever you go, architects seem to have the same pretentious attitude, right down to the same silly round-rimmed glasses where they're cosplaying Le Corbusier. And Corbusier was already a pompous character meant to mock Paris's self-important intellectuals.
Yeah, you were saying he was like the Borat.
Le Corbusier was a character meant to be overly arrogant.
And they ran with it.
And yeah, American architects ran with that shit. Just as Bauhaus was the center of contemporary architecture in Weimar, Germany until 1933, the Soviet Union had a similar institute that went by various names, most famously Vakutimus. Vakutimus was the most prominent of a handful of these institutes, but they were all abolished by the 1932 decree that dissolved all professional creative unions.
Now all art is about the revolution.
Basically, yes. Yeah, in their place was going to be one single organization, the Union of Soviet Architects. And like all organizations after 1932, it was going to make sure everybody was on the same page about socialist realism. In this case, traditional architecture. The most famous names of Russian constructivism were basically phased out, sometimes never to be seen from again, sometimes literally. Vladimir Tatlin, designer of the monument to the Third International. This thing here.
Oh, yeah. The buddy was supposed to frickin' motorcycle up the frickin' thing to develop or to deliver messages to the great leader comrade.
It's not that nobody was going to get killed by it, it's just that they didn't care.
Oh, okay. Yep. Lots of Gopnik. Lots of motorcycle.
Yeah, he had already been told by Trotsky in the 20s that he was not going to be needed for the next little while. And by the 30s, it was clear that that little while was going to encompass the rest of his life.
And Siberia?
No, he was too much of a retarded Gopnik to be a threat.
Oh, okay.
If you look at pictures of the guy, he's below the town retard.
Oh, okay. The two Gopniks, the threatening one and the one too stupid to be meaningfully threatening.
We talked about El Lisitsky and his Prauns, meaning Project for the Affirmation of the New. This guy.
Oh, what a nightmare.
When Lisitsky's avant-garde ideas risked giving him a trip to the Gulag, he made the move that so many Jewish creatives seem to make.
Well, he couldn't go to Israel yet.
Yeah, he transitioned into event planning,
Oh, there we go.
managing various official exhibitions of the
Yeah.
Soviet Union.
Yeah. Yep.
We also talked about Konstantin Melnikov, who designed the Soviet pavilion at the 1925 Paris Expo.
Oh,
This thing.
yeah. This, again, looks like any McUniversity. This is horrifying to see the origins of this. This is the campus that I freaking went to school on.
Academic narratives call this thing a pioneering work of architecture, but contemporary accounts called it sad and depressing.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Melnikov got a little bit of work, but we said in the last episode that there was this new accusation of formalism that was the equivalent of the accusation of degenerate art in Nazi Germany.
Or problematic in 2015.
Yep. Yeah, the accusation of formalism had become so potent that Melnikov was essentially excommunicated in 1937. So by 1937, you had three great bureaucratic societies with three very different ideas of what mass architecture meant. In the New Deal United States, it meant worker housing. In Nazi Germany, when Hitler talked about architecture for the masses, he meant architecture that put forth the grandeur of Germany so the masses could see it and be proud of being German.
Like old school cathedral building shit. All right.
Yep. And in Stalinist Russia, mass architecture meant architecture that inspired the masses to serve the collective, because Stalin knew that nobody was going to be propagandized by concrete cubes.
No.
So while modernism was getting anointed as the chosen style in America, it was finished in Russia, just as much as it was finished in Germany, at least as far as official administrative buildings went. Utilitarian architecture was fine for industry, but mass architecture was going to be ideological. And this was most prominent when it came to city planning. Also, as a side note, Russia actually was facing a severe housing crisis this whole time. So Russia might have actually benefited from some of these hyper-utilitarian worker housing projects. But Russians have never actually cared about the well-being of the peasants.
If they die, they die.
And the Soviet state would regularly demolish houses for one of its ambitious architecture projects, notwithstanding the massive housing shortage.
It is in the way. It is in the way of my new dacha.
Even though it was never built, we mentioned the Palace of Soviets last time, which was authorized in 1932. This thing here, with Lenin
God.
on top of it.
It's a good thing we got past monarchy here, guys. Good thing we're all equal now.
Yeah, this was meant to be the tallest building in the world, and you can't just put up something like this without tearing things down. So they tore down the largest church in Moscow. This thing was supposed to be the home of the leader and the site of all the supreme organs of the party. The cathedral was torn down in 1931, and as tends to happen under communism, the hole in the ground sat there for the entire 1930s and the entire 1940s.
Yep.
And by 1956, it was flooded, and they needed to do salvage work just to salvage the hole.
Jesus.
But the Soviet newspapers at least had a good 25 years to talk about all the great art that was going to be housed in this thing.
It will be best hole you have ever seen, comrade. It will be people's hole.
Yeah, there were all sorts of Pravda articles talking about the paintings and the frescoes and the reliefs and the statues and everything that was going to appear in this thing as soon as it was no longer a hole in the ground.
Gardens not yet planted.
In 1935, the plans for this building were expanded to an entire plan to redesign Moscow. And of course, after the war was finished, thousands of cities and tens of thousands of villages had been destroyed, so they had to be rebuilt. But Stalin was high on the fumes of a historic victory, so he decided to direct all those reconstruction funds and creative resources to an even more grandiose plan to rebuild Moscow.
Of course.
Hitler also had various visions for Berlin being the world's cultural center. We live in the age of cheap air travel today. In the last 10 years for business or pleasure, I've been to New York, London, Dubai, San Francisco, Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, and Buenos Aires. When Hitler took over Paris in 1940, he sounded like a divorced boomer woman who got to see Paris on an eat, pray, love trip. Nowadays, you would expect a world leader to have been to Paris a dozen times. But when Hitler marched through Paris, he said it was like a life ambition fulfilled, getting to go see these museums in the opera house.
It's like there's Disney adults and then there's Paris adults,
Yeah.
and they're both sad in their own way. I
It-
think the Disney adults at least recognize that they're into some slop. The people who are just like, wow, Paris, like, oh god, yep, it's the Louvre. Let's go see the Algerian ghetto.
yeah, Hitler said that Berlin was going to be such a cultural mecca that it put Paris to shame. But I'm not sure how exactly one can make that claim if these places only existed in his head.
Mm,
Likewise, when he had to bail out Mussolini in Greece, he ordered his troops not to damage Athens because it was a sacred site to the arts. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad that he preserved Athens, but he clearly read travel literature more than he looked at a map.
mm,
And it's not a wonder he lost that war based on his misconception of how big Russia is.
yep, no concept. No concept of how wide the channel was. Like he just,
Yeah.
he's a very continental dude.
I'm sure he read books about Siberians. Like that doesn't change logistics.
No. And I think like it's hard for a German to conceive of a country with like infrastructure as terrible as Russia has.
Mhm.
Like, I think that's just outside the realm of they live like these.
It is a big country. They must have all sorts of architecture,
I cannot
of
wait
infrastructure.
to see the high-speed rail. They have one rail line for the.
Hitler's main architect was Albert Speer, who gave as reliable an account of Hitler as anyone else, given that Hitler insisted that he was involved in every architecture project.
Oh God.
When Hitler got word of the planned Palace of Soviets, this thing on the screen right now, Hitler told Speer to one-up Stalin by planning a gigantic dome meant to crown the Volkshall, or the planned House of the People, in the middle of a redesigned Berlin, which was supposed to be built after the war.
Looks like Congress and the Al-Aqsa Mosque had a kid.
Work started in 1939 as ground was cleared for a gigantic arch. This thing here. You would go through the arch, see the names of 1.8 million Germans who died in World War I. Then you would proceed along the boulevard, seeing progressively bigger and bigger buildings until you came to the gigantic 980-foot tall, 22 million cubic meter dome, which expressed the power of Germany. So here's the model for the reconstruction of Berlin. This is what
The White House.
basically the National Mall. Yes.
Yeah.
You basically went through the arch there. The buildings got bigger and bigger, and then you came to that gigantic dome. This is
It's just people, man.
yeah. This model was in the next office over from Hitler's the whole time.
Yeah. Seeing Hitler's priorities, this really fills a hole for me in terms of how the war went as badly as it did for him.
Yeah, exactly. The best laid plans often go awry, especially when you decide to invade Russia.
Well, he couldn't understand that. Like, no, I ordered you to conquer Russia. Why can't? What do you mean you keep having?
Yeah. Needless to say, that dome never ended up getting built.
Mm,
Both Nazi architecture and socialist realist architecture claimed to be the true descendant of antiquity. Hitler believed that the Greeks achieved perfection, but Europe had fallen away from it via race mixing, and that the Germans were going to restore that perfection.
Now, keep in mind, this is like we're getting rid of the Slavs, the Czechs, the like not like you might think of race mixing today. This is a very European race mixing idea.
Yeah, the Soviet theorists said that the Greeks never quite attained perfection, but that the Soviets were going to finally accomplish it.
Oh yeah, Russia. That's where we're gonna find Eden.
In both cases, you had architecture that was very clearly in a neoclassical style. Because there was a dearth of historical moments for Hitler to commemorate, he had to milk the beer hall putsch for all it was worth.
Yeah, and that was a farce of a freaking, putsch. So,
Yeah. Well, he commissioned a putsch memorial in Munich, which is very clearly in the Roman style.
oh wow. And this was a big deal. Every year he went here, and he may have set up a fake assassination attempt early on in this area. Anyway.
Last time we showed the Munich House of German Art, and one famous example was the Nuremberg Stadium, which was designed by Speer. Speer had a mystical theory which he applied in a number of his works, including this building here. He called it the value of ruins. He designed all of his works in such a way that you could still see the Roman resemblance even after thousands of years of decay. So he wanted it to, collapse into nice ruins.
Oh wow, that's German level attention to detail.
Nothing to say beyond that.
Yep.
In 1939, he opened a new German chancellery.
Homie likes right angles.
The official story behind this thing is that it was commissioned in 1938, so this amazing building was done in a year. But Speer's autobiography, written after a 20-year post-Nuremberg sentence, admitted that it was actually commissioned 4 years earlier.
There we go.
On the Soviet side, like I said, you see the Greek Roman neoclassical style as well. For example, you had the Lenin Library in Moscow. You also had a handful of state-commissioned theaters, for example, in Sochi and Alma-Ata. I think this one's the Opera House in Alma-Ata. Yeah, you can see the Kazakhstan flag.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's definitely like a St. Petersburg-esque kind of European revival thing going on here.
Of course, the transition from modernism to socialist realism in the Soviet Union was not a smooth one. These things never are. By the mid-30s, members of the Society of Old Bolsheviks were getting a little bit older, which means they were starting to write their memoirs. They were writing their memoirs about the good old days fighting the revolution side by side with Comrade Lenin. Remember that socialist realism was based on the cult of Stalin. In fact, that was the number one thing about about socialist realism. The cult of Stalin was about to call for getting rid of anyone who might have claimed that Stalin was not a significant player in the early days. And this was not going to spell good news for the old Bolsheviks who were writing their memoirs.
No.
Because most of those memoirs didn't mention Stalin at all. The records are spotty, and even today it's hard to say exactly when Stalin rose to prominence within the party. And that was going to make these old Bolsheviks an inconvenience for Stalin.
Uh-oh. We know what he does to people who become inconvenient.
Well, this is when it happens. As long as you're going after the old Bolsheviks, though, you might as well go after the early 1920s propagandists as well.
Oh, yeah.
Take notes, radical artists. This means that the modernists and the former avant-garde were not going to have a good time either.
Uh-oh. Yeah, it's never fun when the party's over and the revolution's done. It's never a good time for these people.
Yeah, so while Hitler was having his degenerate art exhibition in 1937, Soviet art was going to go through a very different kind of purification ritual, because this was the time of the Moscow trials and the Great Purge. In our last episode, we said that Comrade Sergei Kirov was murdered after some very strange circumstances, which allowed for the rise of Alexei Zhdanov, who was the Commissar of Art. In 1936, the Soviet Union ratified the so-called Stalin Constitution, hailed, including by many members of the American ruling class, as, quote, the most democratic constitution in the world. It granted universal voting. It granted the right to work, it granted the right to rest, and it granted the right to an education. It granted equality regardless of race or nationality. And such a constitution gave Stalin the perfect system to show indiscriminate oppression because it gave legitimacy to the Moscow trials.
Oh, okay. Yeah. They're just trying to fix inequality, people.
It especially gave legitimacy for the Western intellectuals and socialites who were sympathetic to the Soviet cause. And if you read books like The Red Decade, you'll find out that there were an awful lot of Western intellectuals and socialites who were friendly to the Soviet cause.
Americans love just a retarded political theory.
We also talked last time about the Ryutin affair in 1932. Ryutin was the last party member to criticize Stalin publicly. At the time, he was let off lightly, and by lightly, I mean 10 years of exile to Siberia.
Yeah, it's the same they gave Solzhenitsyn.
This is the background. We haven't even gotten to the good stuff yet. The first trial, the trial of the Trotskyist Zinovieite Terrorist Center, or the trial of the 16, happened in 1936. So remember that Stalin had originally formed a triumvirate with Zinoviev and Kamenev to marginalize Trotsky before Stalin fell out with them. And then Zinoviev and Kamenev tried to ally with Trotsky against Stalin in the Comintern. And then Stalin consolidated his power and banished them to Siberia as well. So Zinoviev, Kamenev, and the rest of the 16 were found guilty following a number of confessions beaten out of witnesses.
Yep, yeah, they'll still do that.
There's another story which may be apocryphal or at least exaggerated, but it's indicative of the fact that the mid-30s were the time that Stalin just dropped the act and started ruling with an iron fist. Following Kirov's assassination, Stalin wanted NKVD chief Genrikh Yagoda to find evidence that the old Bolsheviks had been conspiring with Trotsky. When he couldn't find any, Stalin handed the case to Nikolai Yezhov, who then discovered, let's say, a bunch of letters implicating Zinoviev, Kamenev, and a bunch of other old Bolsheviks in counter-revolutionary plots.
Uh-oh.
The next year, 1937, was called Yezhovchina, or the Times of Yezhov, when Yezhov got promoted to the head of the NKVD and made a lot of people disappear. It's estimated that within just over a year, around 800,000 people were either sent to the Gulag or just straight up told to face the wall.
It's amazing there was anyone left to fight the Nazis.
Now, was there any veracity in the story about Yagoda, the first guy standing on principle and not fabricating any evidence, leaving it to his successor to find these letters?
He's like the Sir Thomas More of communism.
Was Yagoda the good guy while Yezhov was the asshole? Not really. Yagoda asked for the bullets to be dug out of the skulls of Zinoviev and Kamenev so that he could keep them in his collection of Soviet memorabilia.
Wow.
Alongside, and I'm not making this up, his collection of erotica and collection of women's stockings.
So just full on, just full Borat. Just, I go to the capital to take picture of women on toilet.
Yes. And dig bullets out of these dapper chicks' heads.
Get me those bullets.
Another personality from this wonderful era was this man here.
Oh, wow.
This is Vasily Mikhailovich Blokhin, the NKVD's chief executioner.
Yeah, he's from Central Casting, the freaking communist executioner guy.
He was ride or die with Stalin from day one. He held that position since 1926, almost from the moment that Stalin took power.
So if this was a biker club, homie would be sergeant at arms. Okay, I get it.
He was only forced into retirement when Stalin died.
Who had to have that chat with him? God.
He was the guy who personally carried out most of the high-profile executions and a lot of not-so-high-profile executions as well.
If you want it done right.
It's hard to say exactly how many people this man personally killed. I've seen estimates as high as 15,000.
Wow.
He was the guy who personally pulled the trigger on Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, and most of the old Bolsheviks. He was also awarded the Soviet Badge of Honor, a civilian award for outstanding achievement.
Wow.
Again, we're dealing with unreliable narrators, but Blokhin really ran up his high score at the Katyn massacre at a POW camp in Poland in 1940. And to be clear, this is before Hitler broke the pact in 1941. This is when the Soviets were purely the aggressors because Stalin decided he wanted to win back some of the land that was Russia's under the Tsar, but was lost in World War I.
Sorry, Finland.
According to the documents released during Glasnost, Stalin ordered the executions and handpicked Blokin to be the man to do it. And if these documents are to be believed, again, unreliable narrator, he somehow managed to kill 7,000 people in 28 days. Doing the math, that's 250 people every day.
It's like Bonnie Blue level volume, like. But imagine being like the most sociopathic Russian. That's amazing. That's like being the cheapest Jewish guy.
When I say Soviet architecture, you probably think of some soulless block of worker housing. So here's real Soviet architecture built for efficiency. Blokin designed a building with an antechamber completely painted red, where the prisoners would be identified, then led into the execution chamber with soundproof walls, a sloped floor, and a drain, and a hose.
It gives you an idea of the volume that this guy was going. It's like slaughterhouse level.
Oh, yeah. Blokin would be in the execution chamber wearing a leather apron, leather hat, and leather gloves.
So the movie Hostel. This was just a real life hostel. Okay.
Yep. The guards would lead the prisoner to a killing spot against the wall where Blokin would shoot him with his Walther pistol.
About 4% of people are sociopaths. Oh.
But it's important that it's a Walther pistol because this may have been a Soviet operation, but when you need to efficiently process that many condemned POWs, you need the reliability of German engineering.
Yeah. This is something Orwell brings up too during this period. He was fighting in the Spanish Civil War, and everybody, even the communists and the anarchists, wanted German weapons.
If the documents are accurate, this means that he processed one prisoner every 3 minutes for 10 hours every night, and at the end of the night, he would make sure the camp guards had all the vodka they needed.
I guess when you love your job, you never work a day in your life.
And my favorite part of the story of this guy, after killing 7,000 people in 28 days, he was given a medal and a modest pay raise.
Good job, comrade.
Now, any good show trial has an air of theatricality. And the first Moscow trial ended with an announcement that said, "It has come to our attention that there may be some subversion yet to be revealed."
Wow. Oh, so it's like a stage show. It's like a bad magic act.
This is like a Chekhov thing. Yeah. After the first trial, Yezhov had been promoted to head of the NKVD, and there were also a number of high-profile one-off arrests and executions, including Ryutin in January of 1937. Ryutin didn't actually break down under interrogation. He maintained his innocence the whole time, so he was just found guilty and shot. Also, his wife and kids were gulagged.
Yeah. Sorry, wife and kids.
That's what happens when you don't confess.
Yep. You think I care about my family? I'm Russian.
The second Moscow trial, the trial of the anti-Soviet Trotskyist Center, or the trial of the 17, it happened shortly afterwards, and the most notable name there was Karl Radek. Now, I swear, I tried to find a picture of this man that does not look like Nazi propaganda. I couldn't.
Holy God, homie is Semitic. Oh, wow. That's like, this is like Seinfeld's dad.
Yeah.
Level.
Funny thing, Seinfeld's dad wasn't played by a Jew. He was actually played by a Gentile.
Wow. I respect that even more now. That's amazing.
He wasn't even, he was actually a retired cop. He wasn't trained as an actor. He was just, a working class New Yorker who knew how to do the Jew act.
See, that's what made Seinfeld great. That kind of stuff.
Radek here, he was a left deviationist, which means, it means he was a Trotskyite, but he gave up the opposition in the late 20s and fell in line behind Stalin, thinking it would save him.
Yeah, sorry, buddy.
Radek is relevant to our story because he spoke at the Conference of Soviet Writers in 1934. We went over that last time. That was when Soviet realism was announced. He gave the official speech denouncing foreign literature, particularly Marcel Proust and James Joyce. Radek said that in Proust's writing, the old world, like a mangy dog no longer capable of any action whatsoever, lies basking in the sun and endlessly licks its sores. James Joyce wrote Ulysses, where every chapter was written in a different style, and Radek said it was like a heap of shit crawling with worms, photographed by a movie camera through a microscope.
Okay.
But this goes right back to the Soviets denouncing formalism in the way that the Nazis denounced degenerate art. Stalin decided that all Soviet literature was going to be socialist realism, and this party apparatchik here got on stage and started denouncing James Joyce like the ultimate communist teacher's pet. And what did it get him? Well, 2 years later, in October 1936, he got a knock on the door and was interrogated, let's say, for the next 3 months.
Enhanced interrogations.
He sang like a canary, as
Oh, yeah.
only an overgrown schoolboy can do.
Only a teacher's pet, snitch guy.
His confession basically implicated all 17 people in the second show trial. And on top of that, with the impeccable style of an intellectual who has gotten in over his head, he said there was another organization out there full of Trotskyists, semi-Trotskyists, quarter Trotskyists, eighth Trotskyists, and others who were using liberalism against Stalinism.
Wait, there were Trotskyist octoroons?
Yes.
All right. Can't let that stand, I guess. It's interesting to me. You see the Emmanuel Goldstein
Yep.
stuff here. Like he's got, this kind of psychology that Stalin's using. It just doesn't work with enemies everywhere. You have to have these enemies in the shadows. And it says, but if I had been this guy's lawyer in Russia, I would have gone up. Or if I'd been the lawyer for the 17, I'd have gone up and said, Comrade Stalin, witness is Jew.
Yeah.
Oh, case dismissed. Down the well with this one. Go.
Only condemn him.
Only condemn. Wait, okay. 17, you are still guilty. Jew, you also guilty. Go with 17.
So Radek here, he was not technically executed. He was just sent to the Gulag, where he was murdered very shortly after arriving.
I wonder if it was the inmates or the guards. Yeah. It could go either way.
Under duress or otherwise, when an eloquent man confesses that there's a secret organization out there, it makes for great propaganda.
Like the Order.
And this is when Yezhov was truly given his moment to shine, because this is when the purges started in full force. The NKVD introduced the Troika, or the three-person panel, who could swiftly and efficiently sentence a subversive. The Germans could build machines, the Soviets could efficiently sentence you to death.
It's priorities, right? Culture and priorities.
That July, the Politburo approved NKVD Order number 00447. This document really streamlined the process.
Wow.
It was looking for, quote, kulaks, criminals, and other anti-Soviet elements. Technically, it did set limits on the number of people in a region who could be shot.
Wait. They commies had bag limits on gopniks?
Technically, yes. Those were, so the people who could be shot were category 1, and category 2 was people sent to the Gulag.
Oh, okay.
But when you start rewarding people for purging subversives, those limits tend to be filled up very quickly.
You got to pad your numbers. You don't want rookie numbers.
And it was not that hard to get permission to raise those limits.
No. Look at gypsies.
If you read, well, yeah, exactly. If you read the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn talks about how these upper limits were very often treated as lower limits.
Yeah. Well, and like they just needed to get a certain number of people. So like this one lady ended up in the Gulag, and her neighbor came over and was like, "So what do I do with this lady's kids?" And the guy needed to put more people in the Gulag, and she was right there.
Yeah.
So she ended up in the Gulag too.
Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned the gypsies. In the Gulag Archipelago, he said that if a local official couldn't find enough ne'er-do-wells in a month, just go find gypsy. Yeah, so there were some darkly funny examples as well. At one point, a photographer was turned in by his apprentice and later executed for saying that the photographic paper was better in the old days.
Wow. Yep. This reminds me of the 2015 online era when they were
Well,
like,
yeah, exactly. It brings up the point that you were not just worried about Big Brother watching you, you were worried about your neighbor ratting you out,
yep.
probably more than Big Brother watching you.
Yeah, Big Brother's very inefficient. Neighbor who doesn't like you or has a beef, secret, yeah. He's more efficient.
Yeah, it's easy to think about Stalin and the Great Terror in abstract terms, especially because nobody ever talks about the 1930s. It's easy to think about Russian factory workers living under the boot for decades on end because that's the kind of evil you see in comic books. But it's when you realize that it was just 1 year, 1937, that's when it starts to become a lot more tangible.
Yep.
This wasn't like over a period of decades. This was just a year, maybe a year and a half that all this happened. Yeah, I lived through the hysteria over Me Too in 2017 and the hysteria over BLM in 2020. Nobody was getting sent to the gulag or the executioner then, but you knew that if the wrong person overheard a joke and wanted to play hall monitor, there would be serious professional consequences.
Remember when Homie got fired for making a
Yeah.
dongle joke?
Yep, exactly.
That happened.
Yep. I can't really picture decades of living under the boot, but I can certainly picture a year of it.
Yep.
Lenin's revolution was supposedly about abstract principles, but in reality, it was about two things: industrializing and building an electrical grid, both of which are complex operations with lots of people who are mission critical. You might think that if you'd been in Russia in 1937, you would have been safe if you had a mission critical role in running a railroad or a mine or a power plant. You'd be wrong. That's the other thing about 1937 that does feel real to me, especially now that we've lived through a couple of these moral panics. I know full well that the girl who gets every lineman fired for a racist joke will be the first to complain when the rolling blackouts start happening.
Yep.
You know, the place you really saw this was the military in Soviet Russia. That was where lots of people ratted out their fellow comrades, especially if it opened up a promotion. Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who held the highest military rank as Marshal of the Soviet Union and was also known as the Red Napoleon for how talented he was executed.
Yep.
A few years later, when World War II started, that's when you really got to see the effects of a military where people had been quickly promoted through the ranks by selling out their comrades.
Yeah, and not based on skill or anything. Fun fact, sometime during this period, because remember, Hitler was not supposed to be rearming. So all of his like tank schools and stuff were like hidden away in the Soviet Union. And Stalin sent his best people to spy on these Germans and figure out what they were doing. And then he was worried that they might have been influenced by the Germans. So he killed all of his top military guys who knew how the Germans were going to fight. That later would bite him in the ass. But anyway.
Yeah, well, like I said, Tukhachevsky, the highest ranking general in the army, a national hero, still got purged.
Yep.
Tukhachevsky played an indirect role in the story of art because he directly intervened in stopping Dmitry Shostakovich from getting purged when his opera, Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, was declared subversive and formalist. Shostakovich's willingness to prostrate himself played a role in the early Cold War, but that story can wait an episode. The remnants of the constructivists and the revolutionary avant-garde who we looked at in our 1920s episode were all done away with, either during the Great Purge or else after Zhdanov just declared that you were going to be socialist realist or else. As a reminder of what some of this avant-garde art looked like, this was Vladimir Stirligov's composition. He was sent to the Gulag in 1934.
Yeah, this better be from a 4-year-old.
Vera Armoleva, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. She was sent to the Gulag in 1934 for producing anti-Soviet propaganda. Then in 1937, she was found guilty of the same charge and executed.
Mm.
Alexander Drevin was arrested in 1937 and executed in 1938.
At least this kind of looks like you're on drugs.
Yeah. I'm just saying, the modern artists who wanted to do something new in the 20s and the 30s, they were going to really wish that they hadn't.
Oh, God.
We talked about Rodchenko, the guy who this sculpture hangs from ceiling. It does not sit on pedestal.
Oh, God.
And he just wanted to dress up like a mechanic.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, if they had like workman fetish.
Yeah, he was the face of constructivism, and he was forced to denounce all of his past work. And in 1935, he gave a public speech saying that he was ashamed of his formalism and was only going
Jesus.
to do socialist realism from now on. And again, we mentioned Totlin earlier. I said that he looked like a retarded Gopnik. Well, there you are. There's below the town retard. Yeah, we talked about his counter reliefs last time. Or we talked about Totlin's counter reliefs a few episodes ago.
He's garbage.
That's a counter
That's
whatever
terrible.
the fuck it is.
He's not Hammock. He's a useless Hammock with garbage.
As best as I can tell, Totlin was a really simple Gopnik, but he disappeared. He worked for a few art organizations, but I'm not convinced he actually did anything. I think he was just so non-threatening that it wasn't even worth purging.
Yeah, he looks like the friggin' Harry Potter's friend, the Weasley kid.
The counter relief that you see on the left here, it was justified by an avant-garde theoretician named Nikolai Punin, who died in the Gulag, though actually not as a result of the purge. He got gulagged after the war for saying that portraits of Lenin were tasteless.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Don't push your luck.
Nope.
Don't push your luck. And, of course, Kazimir Malevich.
Oh, yeah.
The black swear guy. If you...
ultimate art.
Exactly. He didn't say it was the ultimate art. Well, yes, yeah, I guess he did. He also said it was the most honest work of art ever because it was called Black Square, and it was a black square.
It delivers what it promises. No pretension.
He died in 1935, basically knowing what was coming. In 1927, he went to Berlin for an exhibition of his work, and he made sure that his art stayed in Berlin because he knew what way the wind was blowing.
Yeah,
he was just lucky enough to pass away right before the purges hit.
Jesus.
But these are just a few men and women. The real effect of the terror on Soviet art was that everybody made sure to destroy any avant-garde stuff that they might have had in their attic. And that's really the story of the 20th century. Nothing lasted, and we are left having to do a slideshow trying to get some idea of the zeitgeist of the late 30s. There's a lesson here. When you try to throw out the past and build things from scratch, what's to stop the next person from coming along and throwing your stuff out? And that's exactly what happened after Stalin died as well. In the 30s and 40s, Stalin threw out everything from the 20s, and then Khrushchev came in and threw out everything related to the cult of Stalin, which meant basically throwing everything out from the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, there's nothing left but the cult of Stalin by the time Stalin died.
And it was gone within a few years of Khrushchev taking power.
Snap.
But I said there were 3 Moscow trials, so I will finish this storyline. You can only send so many of your high-skilled citizens to the executioner before the novelty wears off. And as the operation was starting to wind down, there needed to be a third act to finish it all off, like a good showman. In March 1938, the third Moscow trial was the trial of the anti-Soviet bloc of rightists and Trotskyites. So he purged the left deviationists. Now time to do the right deviationists.
Like Hitler going after the Catholic trade unions and the secular trade unions.
Remember that when Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev tried to push out Stalin in the mid-20s, Stalin allied with Bukharin at first, but they broke with each other before too long. Bukharin tried to maintain friendly relations with Ryutin following Ryutin's condemnation of Stalin in 1932, and I think with Kamenev as well. Maybe it was for that reason. Maybe Stalin just wanted a full-on palace coup where he killed the entire old guard. I don't know. Whatever the case, in 1936, Bukharin was sent on official business to Paris to negotiate over purchasing the Karl Marx archives. Germany was kind of under new management that didn't much care for Karl Marx in the 30s.
That would be fair.
So Bukharin actually had a chance to defect while he was abroad, but he was just that devoted to the Soviet Union, even though he had told friends privately that Stalin was a devil. But shortly after the second trial, Bukharin and others were arrested for conspiring to overthrow the Soviet state. They were also charged with being part of the conspiracy to kill Kirov, which started off the whole Moscow trial storyline. They were even charged with poisoning Maxim Gorky, who had just died. Gorky was 68 and had tuberculosis.
No, leave nothing to chance.
One other person who was on trial was our friend Yagoda, who was the head of the NKVD for the first trial. The guy who dug out the bullet that killed Zinoviev and Kamenev.
Yeah.
The guy with the collection of women's stockings. Now it was his turn in the barrel.
Yep. You today, me tomorrow.
Yeah, quick trial, expected ending, 18 executed, 3 gulags, lots of family members shot as well. And to put an end to this story, we talked about Yezhov, the architect of the purges. He was eventually unpersoned himself in a famous picture that every millennial saw in a social studies textbook. This one here.
Oh, yeah.
That's the guy on the right.
This is the go-to airbrushed out of history.
Yep. In 1938, Yezhov was replaced by Lavrenti Beria as the head of the NKVD. And from then, it was only a matter of time until a report came out criticizing Yezhov's methods.
Yeah.
He was arrested in 1939, confessed to being an enemy of the people, confessed to being incompetent, confessed to corroborating with the Germans. And Soviet confessions are the ultimate example of an unreliable narrator, but he also confessed to being a homosexual.
Yeah, I give it 50-50.
So that ends this whole story arc, but it does pose the question, why did they bother with the show trials in the first place? This is Russia. You don't exactly need to spray a veneer of respectability on the idea that if you disobey authority, you're in deep shit.
Well, that's baked in.
The answer that it wasn't for them, it was for us in the West. There was no shortage of affluent Westerners who supported the Soviet project and who would make any excuse they could for it. To a rich kid at a New England university, even the most obvious show trial in the world will be taken as proof that the Soviets were following the rule of law.
See, they have trials.
You may think that sounds ridiculous, but remember what I said earlier about this being the time when we learned everything about mass human psychology purely as a result of trial and error and experimenting with propaganda. Certain people are just willing to perform whatever mental gymnastics they need. You know, Lincoln Steffens, an American journalist, visited Russia just after the revolution and famously said, "I have seen the future and it works."
Wow, talk about aging like milk.
What was his proof? He said that Soviet Russia was going through, quote, a temporary condition of evil, which is made tolerable by a hope and a plan.
My God.
So this is like Freud's proof that his theories were true. I don't want to have sex with my mother. See, you're repressing your desire to have sex with your mother.
Yep.
That's what was going on here. So we've looked at the art, we've looked at the propaganda, we've looked at the aesthetics of the Third Reich and of 1930s Russia. But the most obvious question still remains, how exactly was that art received in its day?
Better than the guy on the right in this freaking picture. Nice. Look, comrade, is historical record of river. Beautiful day on river. All that is documented in photo.
These days, you've got the green screen, you change the background. In those days, you change the foreground.
Yep. Just airbrushed out.
So this is an iconic photograph of the 1937 Paris Expo with the Nazi and Soviet pavilions facing each other. Now, it's iconic because it's perfect for Cold War propaganda, which portrays both Hitler and Stalin with the subtlety of Star Wars, where there's a light side of the Force and a dark side of the Force, and there's a very clear villain.
Yeah, not very nuanced in how it's taught typically.
Yeah. And also, the current geopolitical order centered on the UN is supposed to be the dawn of Star Trek. So
let's check in on that.
Well,
holy shit.
We have to ask the question, is it true? No disrespect to fans of Star Wars and Star Trek, but boomer science fiction doesn't exactly help us glean anything about the zeitgeist of the late 1930s. The Paris Expo was a big deal in those days, but you have to remember that this is no more real than a theme park. And contemporary accounts viewed the Nazi and Soviet pavilions as somewhat ostentatious, if not outright tacky.
Yeah. Totalitarianism is tacky. think Orwell talked about that, I think. Or no, Hitchens. Hitchens talked about it. And he's like, they're tacky and they don't care.
Now, we can't completely downplay this photograph, of course, because it's not a total LARP. Within less than 5 years, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, where literally millions of people died. Even without Churchill and the Americans shoving their noses into it, Barbarossa was already the bloodiest war in the history of the world. So there is something to be said for this photograph being historically important as a foreshadowing of things to come.
But it's like Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Like, I remember when Bitcoin kind of came to prominence and it was like a nickel, but like that wasn't my focus. It was a big deal later,
Yep.
not necessarily at the time.
Before anybody accuses us of downplaying the evils of Hitler or Stalin, let's just remember that the post 1945 narrative says that it was a moral imperative to defend the sovereignty of Poland.
How'd that work
Exactly. Nobody says the war is a failure because it didn't exactly end with a sovereign Poland.
out? So sorry, Poland.
Well, supposedly World War II got out of hand because we didn't do anything to stop a scuffle in Eastern Europe. But it's always conveniently forgotten that World War I got out of hand precisely because we did get involved in a scuffle in Eastern Europe. In an alternate timeline, we just ignored Poland, and history books don't call it World War II anymore. It's just the Russo-German War.
And it's just what happens to Polish people. Read their history.
Well, yeah, and it's also remembered as a slap fight between an alcoholic sadist and a neurotic meth addict.
Yep.
So we want to keep this alternate framing in mind because first and foremost, we're trying to understand the zeitgeist of 1937. This is an art history podcast after all. We don't want our image of the 1937 zeitgeist to be tainted by the usual post-1945 Star Wars framing. If you read contemporary accounts about the 1937 World's Fair in Paris and the 1939 World's Fair in New York City, there are a lot of names other than Roosevelt, Hitler, Stalin, and Churchill that cannot be said about most textbooks in the chapter about the 1930s. It's really just those four guys and that's it.
Yeah, it's a weird thing to leave out. It's like they rushed through it at best.
Well, the other big difference is that the United States and the USSR are just two countries among many in 1937. It's not the Cold War where these are two superpowers that call all the shots. And also, just as importantly, Nazi Germany is just another country as well. It's not the embodiment of all that's evil.
Yeah.
In 1937, there was a lot more going on in the world than just Chamberlain was appeasing Hitler.
Yeah, like Hitler at one point, he was Man of the Year for Time.
Yep.
Like this wasn't, this was a guy who wasn't like he was freaking Dick Cheney, where everyone just hated him from day one.
Well, but I'm talking, there's just a lot of stuff that was really important that didn't involve Stalin or Hitler or Roosevelt. For example, Spain was having a civil war. France was descending into chaos under the Popular Front. Italy had just invaded Ethiopia because they're going to have a rematch after World War I.
How important are coffee exports?
Japan had just gone to war with China.
Oh, no, nothing will come of that, I'm sure.
King Edward VIII had just abdicated to marry an American divorcee. Edward was pro-German, and history would have gone very differently if not for one American troublemaker. When you read contemporary stuff written in 1937, Hitler and Stalin are just two other names in the milieu, one of whom was showcasing degenerate art, and one of whom was disappearing a million of his own citizens. When this picture appeared on the front page of newspapers in 1937, nobody looked at this and said these are two imposing empires. Most people just rolled their eyes at the tackiness of the spectacle. The real buzz over the event was all the other countries whose pavilions were a lot more modest and tasteful. So this picture, iconic as it is less of a showdown between two notorious dictators and more of a dick-wagging contest between two idiots. Hitler and Stalin were just two European leaders among many, and the cultural centers of the world were still Paris and London.
Yeah, culture. They still loom large culturally, right? Like, not in this way, but still to this day, right? Like you think, you go to Paris or London, you expect to learn something culturally.
The World's Fair is like the Olympics. At one point, the World's Fair was big enough to turn somebody into an international icon. The World's Fairs are still going on, but nobody gives a shit.
So kind of like ballet and the opera.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, it's like a vestige.
Yeah. As far as the Olympics goes, in the last 20 years, the most culturally significant story involving an Olympian has been Bruce Jenner's gender reassignment surgery. And that guy won the decathlon in 1976, 50 years ago.
But he can't drive a car.
The World's Fair is even more past its heyday than the Olympics are. I had to look it up. The World's Fairs are apparently still happening. The next one is going to be in Riyadh in 2030.
Oh, that'll be interesting. I think the Riyadh Comedy Festival went so well.
I'm sure the Riyadh World's Fair is going to be nothing more than a private party for the jet set. But somehow that event is a successor to the event that gave the world the Eiffel Tower, the Grand Palais, and Art Deco.
Yeah, makes sense.
So about this picture on the screen. In 1937, Paris held the International Exposition of Art and Technology in Modern Life. This event's Eiffel Tower was the Palais de Chaillot. Now, we're trying to break out of the propaganda where all stories begin in 1945. So we are trying to find anything that links the world of 1937 to the world of the United Nations. This building is one such example because it's where the UN signed the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Neoconservative thinker Michael Leedon said every 10 years or so, the United States needs to pick up some small, crappy little country and throw it against the wall just to show the world we mean business. The UN's Declaration of Human Rights is basically what the Americans used to put a veneer of respectability on that practice.
Okay.
So this building here is one of the few transitional forms that take us through that 1945 time curtain.
It's beautiful. Like, it tickles me a little bit. I'm not going to say I don't like this. Something classical, the statues, something nice about this building.
The Palais de Chaillot was built to replace Trocadero Palace, which was itself built for another Paris Expo in 1878. Paris used to be something.
Oh yeah. Now it's just where Algerians live. Sorry, Paris.
If you remember way, way back in our series, in 1907, Pablo Picasso went to an exhibition of African masks at Trocadero Palace. Picasso said it was an extremely dank and depressing building, but it did inspire him to do some experimental painting, which he didn't intend to sell. So this piece just hung in his studio for years.
This was like his White Album?
Yes.
All right, great.
This is called the Brothel of Avignon, or Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And the post-industrial story of art, i.e. the narrative maintained by the Museum of Modern Art, really starts with this painting in 1907 and Duchamp's submission of a urinal to an art show 10 years later in 1917. Now, the story of Picasso is always told as if he was some visionary who broke the mold in the early 20th century when people were ready for a new concept of art for a new century full of new technology. And that's what paved the way for all this post-World War II art that was, let's just be generous and call minimalist, abstract, conceptual.
I have less algorithm-friendly words for it.
A very different way to frame the story of Picasso is to say that his story completely aligns with the story of Paris's World's Fairs. From 1878, which was before he was born, but that's when Trocadero Palace was built, to 1937, at a time when Europe was not subordinate to the United States and the World's Fair held serious status on the global stage. This frames Picasso not as a 20th century visionary, but as a completely mainstream figure from the story that ended in 1945. If you remember, Picasso designed the sets and costumes for a ballet in 1918, and in those days, Sergei Diaghilev's Russian ballet was a huge enough deal to catapult Picasso into international celebrity status.
So is like going on Rogan?
Well, especially because mass media was relatively new, but it had just developed to the point where there could be such a thing as a celebrity. Picasso is viewed as a little bit of a sellout in his own day, but he doesn't give a shit. In 1925, a toned down version of Cubism went global following another expo. In 1925, that was just called Modern, but in the 60s, it was retroactively called Art Deco. We did a whole episode on that. So Picasso's story is really just the story of these World's Fairs. And in 1937, Paris holds yet another expo, tearing down the building where Picasso was inspired to make way for a new building which will symbolize the start of the American century. And Picasso's storyline really does end here at the 1937 Paris Expo. Remember, he did his pioneering work in 1910 and 1911, stuff like this.
Yeah.
He became world famous in the 20s, but by that point, he was happy to just enjoy his status, getting invited to all of Parisian high society's parties. He did a couple of famous paintings in the early 20s, but for the most part, everything he did in the 1910s, and he spent the rest of his life being a caricature of himself. And the guy lived until the 70s. Surprising how recently Picasso died, and really, this painting was from 1910.
Yeah, you don't think of him as a contemporary figure, really, but
Well, he wasn't doing anything meaningful.
important.
Like he just his whole life was, hey Pablo, can you paint us another anatomically incorrect woman?
So it's like somebody who was like really big when hair metal was a thing in
Yeah.
the 80s.
Yeah.
And then he's still dressing like that
Yeah.
in like 2010. He's like Tommy Wiseau.
Playing all the casinos.
Yeah.
Picasso's story really is only the 1910s, but there is one exception, and it was introduced at the 1937 Expo, and it's called Guernica. I'll be honest, I've never understood the appeal behind this painting. It's often called a poignant expression of the tragedy of the Spanish Civil War, but either people are blowing smoke up my ass, or else there are just some aspects of the zeitgeist of 1937 that are truly out of reach to me.
I think like we grew up where there was a whole channel called Adult Swim that was devoted
Yeah.
to like weird drug stuff. And this, I think, had novelty
Yeah.
as like, if you were hip and with it and fun at parties, I guess is a way to say it. This might appeal to you, but this was like maybe the Adult Swim of its day. So this is like the Robot Chicken.
Or the Archer, or the Aqua Teen Hunger Force. So this painting is black and white, and at the bottom you can see what looks like newspaper printing. That's supposed to be a commentary on how news about atrocities gets filtered through the newspaper page. Maybe that's why I don't get it, because one of my earliest memories is CNN reporting on the Gulf War in the early 90s, and CNN is just a very different flavor of war propaganda. Still propaganda, just doesn't look like this.
No.
And that's to say nothing of the current conflicts in Ukraine and Iran, where the medium of choice is the cell phone camera video.
Mm.
Usually these videos are just of drones and exploding projectiles.
And it's like networks of like microbloggers that are determining the news day to day in terms of the cycle. Like,
I'm just saying, those videos bring out a very different emotional response in me than this painting does. Those videos get across the tragedy of war, and there's nothing artistic or poetic about them.
Yeah.
So I will give Picasso the benefit of the doubt and say that maybe the medium really is the message, and that as a millennial, this just was never going to resonate with me at all. But to me, this just seems self-indulgent.
The horror.
Yeah. Again, that's another kind of war propaganda.
Yep.
One of our ongoing arguments is that MoMA's official art history narrative is bullshit, and that it tries to join Michelangelo to Andy Warhol in one united narrative by making connections that just aren't there. We've talked about two works of art in the narrative that seem to be completely out of place chronologically. First was Claude Monet's Water Lilies. That was so out of place that we had to do one episode just about that painting. And the second is Grant Wood's American Gothic, which seems to completely break the pattern of painting looking more and more abstract and like shit.
Yeah.
That painting is not supposed to be a painting from 1930 if you look at the rest of the timeline in the narrative. Guernica is a third one of these paintings that just doesn't fit into the narrative chronologically. In the narrative, Picasso's pioneering storyline goes from about 1907, when he painted the brothel at Avignon, to 1921, arguably only to about 1918, when he did the sets for the ballet. But then there's this one work in 1937, and it came out of a World's Fair, not out of some avant-garde studio.
Okay.
And that tells us that Picasso may not have been part of the Academy, but he still spent his life hanging around with the movers and shakers who put on these institutional events. After 1945, the institutional power moved from Paris to New York, and you never heard a word from Picasso again. But this painting is also important for one more reason, and that's that it places the Spanish Civil War in the timeline. Because, like so many things about the 1930s, the Spanish Civil War seems like a free floating historical event. The Vietnam War feels like a 60s war, the first Iraq War feels like a 90s war, the second Iraq War feels like a 2000s war. I can read an encyclopedia that says that the Spanish Civil War started in 1936. It does not feel like a 30s war to me.
Yeah.
At least in the post 1945 story, it doesn't feel like a 30s war.
Yeah.
Part of that is that academics don't like to talk about the idea of communists being successfully subdued by force.
Yeah. And the superiority of German weapons over Russian weapons.
Yeah, they don't want the proles getting any ideas.
Nope.
But it's also because World War II is so often cast as an ideological clash as opposed to just another war between existing alliances. Post-war propaganda depends on casting World War II as the free world against fascism, even though it takes a lot of gymnastics to come up with a definition of free that includes the Soviet Union, especially after the Holodomor and forced industrialization and the Great Purges, which had already happened by this point.
Yeah, and then they capped it off by just like essaying every woman
Yep.
in Eastern Europe that they captured. So
Yeah, but that was when the Americans decided Stalin was bad again.
you knew we were Russians.
Oddly enough, in the 1930s, both Portugal and Greece elected governments that could be considered fascist or at least fascist adjacent, and nobody seems to have any problem with those. So there's a lot of glitches in the matrix here.
The Greeks aren't efficient enough to make fascism work.
Yeah, but fascism was an attempt to change that.
They still couldn't get the trains running on time, I bet.
At least on the European side, the sides in World War II were not ideologically determined. Let's put an end to this misconception once and for all, because the two sides of World War II were just the supporters of each side in the Spanish Civil War. Mussolini was not aligned with Hitler because they were both fascist. Mussolini had been slapped on the wrist by the League of Nations for invading Ethiopia, and he'd been sanctioned by the British and the French. That's what pushed him towards Hitler, and as a result, both Italy and Germany provided material support to Franco's loyalists during the Civil War.
And a young National Socialist Party.
Yep.
Even though ideologically they're very different. There's not really a concept of racism in fascist Italy if you go and study their documents. So it's it was he had a Jewish mistress. To give you the dictator of Italy, to give you an example of how serious.
Who he put in charge of the arts.
Yeah.
Don't tell Hitler that one.
What?
The Soviets, on the other hand, they provided support to the Republicans, who were as comically dysfunctional as you would expect an army of ideologically driven communists to be. Hitler did briefly sign a pact with Stalin in 1939 before breaking it in 1941. But the sides of World War II were not the light side and the dark side of the Force in Star Wars. They were the alliances that had been drawn following the wars in Ethiopia and Spain.
Yeah, Tolkien lived through this whole mess, and he one thing he wanted to make very clear is that Lord of the Rings is not an allegory for World War II, because that was all taking shape in the post-war order, and he came right out and said, no, not an allegory. And then he said, if it had been an allegory for World War II, there just would have been it would have been just Sauron versus Saruman. Yeah. It would have just been evil on evil. And anyway,
Picasso was a communist, so his sympathies were with the Spanish Republican government, who had commissioned him to do a painting for the 1937 Expo. And that's how you got this thing. The whole Spanish pavilion was just propaganda for the Republican side of the Civil War, though. There were poems, there were paintings, there was a large inscription above the main entrance with the usual shibboleths about the Spanish people fighting for freedom and self-governance, though there are some quite graphic pictures out there of the things they were willing to do in the name of so-called freedom. Don't look up the pictures of what they did to nuns.
Yeah.
But neither side's hands were clean in that war, and a couple months before the Paris Expo, Franco asked Hitler to send the Luftwaffe to bomb the shit out of a Basque town called Guernica.
And Hitler was like, this is a great chance for me to test my dive bombers.
Well, to be very clear, yes, the Germans bombed civilians, but under the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was the proto-rules-based order, Guernica was considered a legitimate military target, so we can argue all day long about whether or not it was or was not a war crime. And the side that bombed Dresden a few years later really doesn't have a high horse to sit on either.
No, neither side has a monopoly on atrocities.
Yeah. But, international treaties are just words on paper, and at some point, aviation technology had advanced to the point where civilians were going to be collateral damage of aerial warfare. The citizens of Guernica won the lottery to be the first collateral damage of aerial warfare.
So they were the Boers
Yep.
of the concentration camp program. They were the lucky ones. Okay.
Yeah. Whatever you think of Picasso's painting, at the very least, it anchors the timeline of the second half of the 1930s, and I think it properly puts the Spanish Civil War in the historical context. And that brings us back to the 1937 Paris Expo, with these two dueling monoliths. This event is important because it reminds us that 1937 was not the Cold War, when every country had to be on the side of one of two superpowers. Hitler and Stalin were just two players on a crowded chessboard jockeying for position, and they thought the way to do that was to build a big phallic symbol.
Russians and Germans gonna Russian and German.
Let's first get a feel for the event in general, because this isn't the post-1945 world where every new building has to be a hideous, brutalist concrete slab or a soulless box made out of metal and glass with exposed wires and pipes.
Sorry, migrating birds.
Yeah. In the 1930s, the global elite still had taste, because it hadn't moved to New York yet. If you look at the other international pavilions, a lot of them had a more modern or rational aesthetic, but I use those words cautiously because they were generally tasteful, unlike some de Style or Le Corbusier prefabricated eyesore.
Where the roof leaks.
Like, here's the British pavilion, and you can see the Canadian pavilion next to it, as it should be.
Hey, man.
It wasn't over the top. It wasn't like some big German monolith with a big eagle on top of it. This, turned a lot of eyeballs.
Very tasteful.
In fact, I think there in Canadian museums, there are murals that were in that pavilion right there. We used to be a proper country.
Once upon a time.
Here,
We went from the most vicious soldiers in the empire next to the Gurkhas to Justin Trudeau.
Vicious in a different way. Vicious in a way that women are vicious.
Yeah. Homie can box.
In a confined environment, in a controlled environment, yes.
I think he'd do well in prison. For a lot of reasons.
Yeah. Because he can negotiate, not because he can fight.
You got the carrot and the stick when you're Justin in prison.
I'm not sure which one of those two is the analogy you're going for.
That's the
They
beauty
both work.
of that style. Can you go more carrot or more stick?
You see the Belgian pavilion in the bottom left. Again, it's modernist. It doesn't look like an old Belle Epoque building with turrets and ornamentation on it, but I think it's still somewhat tasteful.
Yeah, look, this just reminds me again of a fortification, which I guess would be useful if you're Belgium at this point, but oh well.
In the bottom right, this is the Swedish and the Czechoslovakian pavilions. Again, maybe not the most creative and inspired ones, but these were actually the ones that got a lot of the buzz, not the German and Soviet ones.
Okay.
And then the top right, that's the Japanese pavilion.
Like a Zen garden.
Again, the Japanese pavilion, I think, got a bunch of buzz as well. Because remember, the West has been full of weebs since Vincent van Gogh.
So what are you guys gonna do now that the Americans cut off your oil? What? Come back here.
So again, it's very much a post 1945 narrative that image of the two dueling pavilions was a preview of World War II. Again, you can't completely write it off either because Stalingrad happened a few years later. But these are the pavilions that everybody was, talking about in 1937, not those ones. Everybody just thought those two were tacky.
These are the ones that got the attention. Okay, interesting.
And you can definitely see the lasting impact of Art Deco from the 20s. Like these buildings are less ornate and more geometric, but they're also not trying to thumb their nose at history and culture either. Like this isn't some Le Corbusier concrete cube here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of happy medium between the two.
Exactly.
We forget in the modern world that there are shades of gray.
Or an age without nuance.
Again, art history narratives, they all focus so heavily on the radical aesthetics of the 1920s because professors and critics need to justify their jobs as they defend the latest hideous installation.
And don't retire.
Yeah. Those narratives never mention the fact that modernism was niche even in the 20s, and in the 30s the goal was to take some of those developments and assimilate them and synthesize them with historical aesthetics in the way that the arts and crafts movement did in the 1880s or Art Nouveau did in the 1900s. That's what's going on here. That's why these things look tasteful.
Okay.
But yes, you're starting to see the modern minimalism coming in.
And these are all the people that got blown up.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Some more so than others.
Yeah, Canada got off easy.
Well, I'm talking about Japan and the upper right. Some got blown up with more novel technology than others.
It's got the latest techniques.
Even the event's title, the International Exposition of Art and Technology in Modern Life, gives us a hint of what this event was supposed to be. Once again, we see that the cult of progress was alive and well in 1937. The Great Depression was still going on. People were still getting crushed under inflation. But everybody had faith that progress was going to come in and save the day eventually, instead of, Hitler rolling in 3 years later. Of course, an indulgent event like a World's Fair is a much harder sell under the economic conditions of the 1930s, even though the 1925 Expo was a huge success. France had just elected the Popular Front coalition government because in 1935, the Comintern had sent out a new party line saying the 5-year plan is over, Stalin no longer needs radical foot soldiers everywhere. So it's now your duty as a good communist to win friends by pretending to be super patriotic and aligning yourself with any other left-wing causes against the fascists. The Popular Front government was a disaster, to put it lightly, but it came out of that.
Okay.
If Germany hadn't invaded, there's a very real chance that France was headed for a civil war, just like Spain was. But at least the government had an excuse for holding the World's Fair because it was explicitly sold as a make-work project meant to get the country through hard times. Commie's gonna commie.
Yeah.
Also, when you're trying to sell yourself as the global cultural trendsetter like Paris was, the optics are not good when all your artists are unemployed. Yeah, that's the flip side of the coin when large numbers of artists can now work outside the academy and the economy goes sour. Now, when it comes to optics, there are other challenges that come with a make-work program. Namely, make-work programs tend to have poor organization. And it's really not a good look for France that other countries sent people to build their pavilions and France couldn't get its own pavilion open on time.
Jesus Christ. A monument to socialism, almost.
Now, as easy as it is to blame the Americans for ruining art when the cultural center of the world shifted from Paris to New York, you can see in 1937 that the focus is already beginning to shift away from aesthetics and towards practicality and new technology. For example, there was an aviation pavilion. That's a picture on the left, a painting on the right. You can see the modernist mural in the background. It's not some contemporary artist splashing paint on a canvas to see what he can get away with, but it's definitely still a modernist aesthetic. Here's a closer look at it.
Okay.
Dare I say it, it's tasteful when it's in the background of a display meant to showcase new technology. And you see this across the political spectrum with modern art paired with new technology. The one exception being Nazi Germany. Hitler was not going to allow any modernism. But the German pavilion still notably showed off its more advanced television than anybody else had.
Yep. Again, whoever has control of the like most current information technology is somebody you got to watch.
As the story goes, Hitler didn't even want to participate in this event, possibly because Germany wasn't invited to the 1925 Expo. But his architect, Albert Speer, who we mentioned earlier, he had gotten news that the Soviets were going to build a gigantic, imposing pavilion. And he convinced Hitler that he could give a huge middle finger to the communists by building an even more imposing pavilion.
Oh,
So it was a dick-wagging contest.
prelude to Stalingrad, as you said.
Let's start with the Soviets.
Oh, it's ugly.
Yeah, this building was designed by Boris Iofan, and it was supposed to be as unsubtle as possible. It was a big, streamlined block with a tower topped by a huge group structure called Worker and Collective Farm Woman, holding a hammer and sickle, of course.
Yep.
The brochure explicitly said that the sculpture was supposed to be socialist realism, so you don't need to worry about how to classify it.
It's art for the revolution.
And in a line straight out of 1984, the brochure also said that, quote, the most important quality of the Soviet pavilion as a work of architecture is the fullness of its imagery and its ideological completeness.
Wow. I would if a modern progressive wouldn't put it like, that would be too on the nose for a modern progressive. Like,
So this is the red corner. What do we have in the brown corner? Here's the Nazi pavilion. This thing was 500 feet high. The building material weighed 10,000 tons. And the statue on top, its symbolism is equally as unsubtle, being an eagle holding a swastika.
yep.
At the foot of the building was Joseph Thorak's 20-foot sculpture called Comradeship, which exalted the human body in a manner reminiscent of the ancient Greeks.
This looks like something that could be on the cover of like a gay porn novel.
Yeah, I was going to say, is this homoerotic enough for you?
Jeez, you can tell that the genitalia is built for a reception, which is something you notice, like a motif you see in ancient Greek art as well. So,
well, it also gives a bit of insight into Hitler's attitudes on art über alles, because Emil Nold was a card-carrying Nazi, basically from day one, but he was a modernist, and he was banned from touching a paintbrush the day that Hitler came to power. On the other hand, the guy who did this, Joseph Thorak, he was a communist until the day before Hitler came to power, and Hitler had no problem letting him make this sculpture.
I bet Rome liked them.
But let's go back to the main picture of the event. Clearly, both pavilions were trying to send a message, not just with size, but also using the idioms of neoclassical architecture. But artists like Gio Severini just said that the two pavilions didn't really send a message beyond we're trying too hard.
Yeah, it's obvious and it's tacky.
Yeah, to be clear, both Hitler and Stalin viewed the event as a success simply for being able to get the damn things built, because it set the tone for the kind of architecture that they both had planned to build at home.
Okay.
But as far as showing off to the world, no, this image, nobody would look at this image in 1937 and view it the way we view it now.
It's like if North Korea had a pavilion. It's like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
My goal in the last 3 episodes has been to paint a picture of the 1930s. I want to contextualize things so that the 1937 Expo sits in a historical context that goes back centuries. But that story just ends abruptly without really resolving at all. A few years later, all of Europe was in rubble. The Americans, they had been a minor player when they stepped onto the world stage with the Spanish-American War in the 1890s, but in 1945 they had everything, including total cultural hegemony, and they were imposing a completely different geopolitical order, at least based nominally on rules. Rules in quotation marks there. We are trying to break the propaganda frame where the story starts in 1945, but on some level, there really is a complete discontinuity. In 1937, there are still lots of countries in Europe operating in a milieu that went back at least to Westphalia or Henry VIII. In 1945, they're all subjugated to the United States or the Soviet Union, which were virtual non-entities 50 years before.
Mm.
In 1939, Hitler and Stalin signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact.
Thank you, Molotov and Ribbentrop.
Modernism and avant-garde art were revolutionary in the early 20s, but by the time Zhdanov became the Commissar of Socialist Realism in 1934, modernism was already being called fascist in the Soviet Union, and it was linked with conspiracy theories about Trotsky subverting the country. The old modernists were forced to denounce their old work as formalist, and that's if they were lucky enough to not get gulagged or shot.
Mm.
But when the Nazi-Soviet pact was signed, modernist art was no longer called fascist, just bourgeois. So what does that tell you about how this stuff is all based on politics?
Mm.
And it goes the other way as well. Hitler had been referring to modernism as cultural Bolshevism since he wrote Mein Kampf in 1924. But as soon as he signed the pact, modernism was no longer Bolshevik, just Jewish. That didn't go anywhere.
Yeah. Speaking of ending abruptly.
So this is why I think art is truly a meaningless concept by this point. In one breath, the intellectuals look down on us because we just don't get the context or whatever behind an abstract painting. But in the next breath, they say that the truly enlightened meaning always seems to align with whatever ideology gives them the highest status. That game stops working by the 1930s when the ideology changes every 5 years, and the only people who survive in the bureaucracy are the most Machiavellian, sycophantic yes men.
Beetlemen, as Orwell called them.
Yeah, just miserable human beings.
Yep.
When I went through school, I heard Ceausescu described as this brutal dictator. When you see pictures of him, he's just a retarded bureaucrat.
Yep.
Just somebody who kept getting promoted.
He just failed up.
And he put his wife in charge of the university's Department of Chemistry.
Wow. It's like out of like a Borat.
Yeah.
It's like
The chemists had to convince her to sign off on chemicals.
oh my God.
In 1939, there was some language in the Nazi-Soviet pact about cultural exchange. Who knows how sincere it was, but it's a moot point because Hitler broke the pact and invaded in 1941. And to be honest, there's not much to say about German culture after 1939 when Hitler was too busy invading Poland and fighting Churchill to be focused on art. This finally gave Joseph Goebbels the opening he needed. It gave him the freedom to make some artistic choices without the Fuhrer breathing down his neck. And remember that Goebbels was an expressionist, and he at first had some hope that Hitler might let him incorporate some of that into his work as propagandist, but Hitler put the kibosh on that very quickly. In 1939, now that Goebbels was out from under the thumb of Hitler, he didn't have to focus on painting and the fine arts anymore. He focused on film and cinema as his medium of choice. And the style of painting associated with Hitler just it does go on for a few more years. They're still holding their Nazi art shows at the House of German Art in Munich, but that's really the end of that storyline. It dies with the Third Reich.
So it's like the 80-year-old, like TV execs that are still worried about they're worried about like network TV in the age of the freaking internet.
Yep. Well, especially the ones who are sincerely worried about it. Not they're just clinging to their job.
Yep.
Because they still have to pay child support.
Mm.
So that's really the end of this storyline. If it feels like there are a lot of unresolved threads, there are. The Allied occupation after 1945 was the last time that an occupying force truly got rid of the native culture. And this is what it looks like. The Volkisch movement was outlawed. Any book mentioning Nazi ideology was mulched. Prussia, A political and ethnic identity was somehow just written out of existence by a decree.
It's like if Canada got invaded and they were just like, yep, no more Quebec.
Yep. Yeah, no, the Allied Controlled Council in 1947, somehow they were able to issue a decree that said, yep, Prussia doesn't exist anymore.
no more Prussia. No.
In the post-1945 rules-based order, real wars of conquest haven't been allowed, so it feels a little weird to think about an outside culture being imposed by force, but that is exactly what happened in Germany during the Allied occupation. The centuries-old story of Europe just came to an end to be replaced by bureaucratic American hegemony imposed via the United Nations. But real history seems to be coming back now as China's takeover of Hong Kong and Putin's invasion of Ukraine are proving just how much weight international law holds in the 2020s.
We have a freaking naval blockade going on right now. Like, this is freaking age of sail shit. Like this. Are we fighting Napoleon?
Trump wants to bring back battleships.
Yep. Well, that's great. An age where a $1,500 freaking drone can take out your $300 million radio system that's really delicate and finely tuned. Yeah, you're gonna build the Bismarck. All right.
For those of you unaware, the idea of Luke Skywalker taking down the Death Star was based on the Bismarck.
Yeah, the X-wing is kind of inspired by the biplane, and a biplane came in and with the torpedo took out the rudder of the Bismarck, and it couldn't maneuver, and that inspired Lucas. Take that lesson.
And if you're under the age of 25, ask your parents what Star Wars was,
Yeah.
and also ask them what World War II was.
Yep. Yeah, I got a young wife, and she knows a whole lot about residential schools, and nothing about World War II.
So the story of German art and architecture, it's really finished in 1939, even though the symbolic end came in 1945 when the Soviets demolished what remained of Speer's Reich Chancellery, and they used some of the marble from that in their own monuments.
Like the stone, a spoon.
Yep. But you could argue that Hitler was just delaying the inevitable by clinging to the aesthetics of the late 19th century. In 1935, you could still propagandize the masses with an epic painting, but that was only going to last so long. And if you have to worry about how effective painting is as a propaganda technique, you're playing a losing game in the long run. And it really also calls into question what exactly art even is. So that's the end of our 1930s storyline, but I have to finish with an epilogue. In 1937, there were three bureaucratic ideologies looking to take over the world. Liberal democracy, which was really just a rebranding of American WASP progressivism, National Socialism, and Stalinism, which was at least nominally a version of Marxist-Leninism. It feels easy to accept that one of these ideologies was destroyed by force in 1945, and another one was subordinated and collapsed under its own weight in the early 90s. For some reason, it feels a lot harder to say that there were three visions of art in 1939, one of which was the big winner after World War II and the Cold War. For some reason, it feels normal to say that one ideology won by force, but something feels wrong about saying one vision of art won by force when they're really the same thing.
Yep.
It feels uncomfortable to say that our concept of art is just an appendage of American hegemony, and that hegemony was achieved by firebombing Dresden and dropping 2 atomic bombs. But, them's be the breaks.
How else are you going to establish a hegemony?
Hitler's concept of art really did die with the Third Reich. If there were three concepts of art competing for supremacy in 1937, there were two in 1945. And Soviet art may have turned in a more conservative direction in 1932, but after World War II, it went full-on academic classicism. Stuff like this.
Wow.
And here's another one. This is what you think of when you think of Soviet art.
Makes me want to sing the Soviet national anthem. La da 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 da.
Yeah, in 1919, the Bolsheviks abolished the Imperial Academy, as they abolished all Tsarist institutions. Lenin and Trotsky believed it would create what they called free creativity, and they ended up with a painting of a red wedge and a white circle.
What a nightmare.
In 1947, Stalin just said fuck it and reestablished the Imperial Academy.
Yep. Well, he did the same thing with the church later. I was like, fuck it, bring it back.
This aesthetic is a far cry from the first few years of the Soviet Union, when a bunch of avant-garde constructivists were making sculptures out of industrial surplus, preaching that a new art was needed to build the new man. So what happened? Well, from 1946 onwards, Stalin established a code of laws for art and the propaganda machine, and Zhdanov had proven himself such a good commissar of socialist realism in the 1930s with his bold leadership strategy of sending you to the gulag with a firing squad if you went off message.
Again, no subtlety.
Yeah, he'd proven himself so loyal that Stalin was going to put him in charge again, creating a brand new wave of terror where you were sent to the gulag if you didn't follow the new set of rules. And what were these new rules after World War II? The Soviet Union was originally supposed to be some great experiment in utopian internationalism, and the UN was supposed to be this international body that made nationalism a thing of the past. Immediately after the war, Stalin said fuck it and went full on Russian ultranationalism.
Yep.
And for centuries, what always happened when Russia went ultranationalist?
What?
Pogroms.
Yeah. Sorry, ethnic minorities.
A stop clock is right twice a day, and Russia has a pogrom at least 4 times a century. It just happens.
We have Gopnik surplus. We must call the herd.
When Zhdanov was in charge of socialist realism, he would send you to the gulag for being a formalist, even though formalism was a loosely defined term that he could apply to any of his enemies. After World War II, he would send you to the gulag for being a, quote, rootless cosmopolitan. And that phrase had exactly the ethno-religious connotation that you think it does.
Like East Coast elites or globalists?
Yeah. And here's a lesson if you're a political radical.
First, get a job.
The Soviet Union in the 1930s, especially under socialist realism and socialism in one country, preached what we would now call multiculturalism. Official culture celebrated the Russians, the Georgians, the Jews, the Ukrainians, the Kazakhs, and every other ethnic group in the country. If you wanted to be a party bigwig in the 30s, you needed to get on board with this proto-multiculturalism. That works in the 30s. It doesn't work so well when Stalin starts gulagging people for treason for being insufficiently Russian nationalist.
So it's like if we really did get some kind of fascist in power and he started going through people's Twitter.
Yep.
What was your opinion in 2015?
I thought diversity was our strength. Well, that's a very treasonous idea. It's not even if we got a fascist coming to power. It's if our current leaders change their mind.
Yep.
It becomes very inconvenient when you had just spent the last decade establishing yourself as more pro-multicultural than everybody else.
Yep.
And let's be very clear here. Zhdanov's campaign against rootless cosmopolitans was just as anti-Semitic as Hitler's was.
Russian's gonna Russian.
Well, again, it's a very post-1945 narrative that Hitler had the monopoly on doing things to that specific group.
Yeah, that's just a normal thing. That's just what happens to these people.
In fact, Solzhenitsyn said the luckiest thing that ever happened to the Jews was that Stalin died when he started to purge them.
My Baba's grand criticism, I had 2 grandparents that lived through this war on the front lines, and their greatest criticism after watching the German army and the Einsatzgruppen roll through Ukraine was, Jay, they didn't kill Jews, they killed everyone. They were rounding up people by the busload and truckload and taking them to anti-tank ditches.
Very efficient.
And yeah, very efficient. And the only kink in the efficiency is these crazy Einsatzgruppen guys who were like Hitler's like crazy fanatical troops. It turns out like shooting kids in the face all day is a pretty miserable job. And that's when they turn to industry. Like good Germans.
But remember, we talked earlier in this episode about Stalin's chief executioner.
Yeah.
He didn't have a problem with it.
No, that man took his work home.
He did it for a modest pay raise.
Yep.
So you see an interesting parallel here. Napoleon invaded Russia in the 1810s. He lost horribly, but the Russian intelligentsia ended up with a huge block of westernizers who idealized Paris and wanted to import Western ideas into Russia to fight Russia's backwardness.
Good luck.
Dostoevsky wrote a whole novel about how that's impossible.
Yep.
When Hitler invaded Russia in 1941, he also lost badly. But when the Russian army occupied Berlin, they also brought back ideas of art and propaganda, including opinions about the negative influence of the rootless cosmopolitans.
Which there was already a rich tradition of in Eastern Europe.
Well, especially the rootless cosmopolitans in the arts.
Yep.
That attitude was brought straight back from Berlin to Moscow after the war.
Like a rocket scientist.
But it went deeper than that. The new art was going to focus on the character of the people, just as Hitler's art did, and just as Vince McMahon did in the 80s when you knew which wrestler to cheer for because he was the one draped in an American flag.
And in 2015 with Trump.
By the 50s, the Soviets were calling Impressionism degenerate and removing all art since the 1880s. So these were the people who couldn't import Parisian culture enough. Now they're saying they want Hitler's culture. They want Berlin culture. A lot of this stuff gets airbrushed out. So even though Hitler's ideas of art were completely destroyed in Germany under the Allied occupation, Stalin was basically implementing them all note for note. And the pièce de résistance was architecture. The post-World War II plans for constructing Moscow became basically as grandiose as Hitler's urban reconstruction plans. And to be clear, Moscow was not really destroyed in the war. There were a lot of Russian cities that were destroyed in the war. Stalin was just going to say, yeah, that's lower on the priority list.
It's like Minas Tirith. The enemy got right up to the gate of Moscow, but never got in.
Yeah.
At least not in the book.
Yeah, so all the funds for reconstruction were going to be redirected toward buildings like this, projecting Soviet glory. This is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This was a bureaucratic building in Moscow that was prioritized over the thousands of cities and tens of thousands of villages that were subject to the scorched earth policy.
Yeah, there's the Muscovy. And then there's everyone else in the empire. And you really, really want to live in or near Moscow to this day, if you can.
In 1947, not only was the Imperial Academy reestablished, but Pravda was writing stories saying that the idea of an artistic movement was unacceptable because movements were bourgeois. So let's review. Since the revolution, first, academicism was bourgeois because anything backward-looking is counter-revolutionary. Then realism was bourgeois. Then avant-garde art was banned in the mid-20s for, quote, squandering the past like a bunch of bourgeois types. Then formalism was bourgeois. Then formalism was fascist. Then internationalism was bourgeois. Then all art movements are bourgeois and academicism is the real art. Then they start condemning all modern art as degenerate, frequently accusing it of being part of a Jewish conspiracy. So things went full circle on that one.
So the Germans, they weren't just building Sputnik. They were brought some culture and some, I think, at least one of the SS guys or one of them ended up in the Soviet secret police.
Oh, yeah. How does it all end, though? Remember that in 1931, the Palace of Soviets was commissioned. I said earlier that this was meant to be the tallest building in the world, the official residence of the Soviet leader, and the venue of all the major organs of the Communist Party. A huge cathedral had to be torn down to make way for this thing, and for the next 10 years there was a hole in the ground. Then World War II...
like Ground Zero.
Yep. Then World War II came and went, and it was still a hole in the ground.
Also, okay, like Ground Zero.
And Stalin died in 1953, and it was still a hole in the ground.
Okay.
By 1956, the hole had flooded to the point they needed to salvage the hole if they wanted to build this thing.
He's lake now. He's a reflecting pool.
But by that point, did anyone want to build this thing anymore? After the revolution, Lenin and Trotsky tore down the old Imperial Academy and any other vestige of the Tsar, replacing it with avant-garde and modernist art. In 1932, Stalin announced Soviet realism, which tore down all the avant-garde and modernist stuff and replaced it with a new type of folk art and literature that was on the same page. And then in 1946, he tore all of that down and replaced it with ornate classical and academic works praising the glory of Stalin and Russia. You can only tear down so many things if you want to leave a legacy behind, because when Khrushchev came to power, he immediately instituted a policy of de-Stalinization, undoing Stalin's artistic legacy of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and it was undone quite rapidly. We just showed this building, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. When I say the phrase Soviet architecture, it conjures up images of very brutalist, very utilitarian buildings. That was not built under Stalin. In fact, Stalin willfully ignored housing shortages just to build stuff like this.
It's Uncle Joe.
During the last 17 years of Stalin's life, you were more likely to see concrete worker housing projects in the West. In 1945, right at the end of World War II, the city of Marseille commissioned our good friend Le Corbusier to grace its landscape with one of his creations. It was finished in 1952, but one of the first things that happened when the war was finished was it was commissioned. Let's see what Le Corbusier graced the world with.
Oh, God.
Looks like it was built from an off-brand Lego set.
Yeah. It's
where
like
half the blocks are colored and the other half are concrete.
It's like a primitive TV. Playing a horrible, terrible little pixels. Ugh.
Yeah, it's called the Cité Radieuse, or the Radiant City. If you agree with Oswald Spengler that we are on the last legs of civilization, Exhibit A is the fact that this thing was the first thing built after World War II, and it's called the Radiant City.
Yeah, that war broke us.
Like every other one of Corbusier's creations, the locals hated it, but when the textbooks were written about it years later, they all say the same thing. The public just wasn't ready for it.
Those rubes.
And like every other one of these hideous concrete blocks that we looked at in our 1920s episodes, it was designated a UNESCO heritage site. Because in architecture, talent and aesthetics will always be trumped by institutional power.
Yeah. Especially when it comes to architecture.
Yeah. In theory, this was supposed to be a block of rental units meant for people displaced by the war. It did not take long for the bourgeois social climber types to start buying up these units as a status symbol.
So like the condo of its day. All right.
Frank Lloyd Wright said that Le Corbusier barely built anything, but every time he did, he would write 4 long-winded books about it, and this building is no exception.
God.
Corbusier wrote about how he scientifically came up with the proportions based on the proportions of the human body, and how this thing is supposed to be like an indoor city with essentially a shopping mall on the ground floor and a communal space on the roof. The one thing that I will admit is kind of cool about this building is that every apartment was 2 stories, with the lower story on the front of the building facing the city and the upper story on the back of the building facing the ocean, connected by a diagonal staircase, or vice versa.
All right, I get it. That's kind of neat.
But every time you see some high-status work of mid-20th century brutalism that can be described as rational or geometric, from the UN building in New York to the entire city of Brasilia, the architect was inevitably trying to be the heir apparent to Corbusier and this building here. So it's the root of the poison tree.
Okay.
Stalin wanted nothing to do with this, at least after he declared socialist realism in the 1930s. And yet, this is a lot closer to the mental image conjured up by the phrase Soviet architecture.
Oh yeah. This is I think about like my freaking cousins living in this stuff.
Yeah. So what's going on here? Why is this called Soviet architecture when the West was doing it for almost 2 decades first? Well, there's a real simple explanation, and that's that brutalist housing blocks were part of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization policy when Khrushchev decided that large monuments were not the best way to deal with a massive housing shortage. So these utilitarian concrete housing blocks were not really a Soviet thing so much as a Khrushchev thing. And, the West beat the Soviets to it by quite a long time.
Like Khrushchev beat the table at the UN with a shoe.
But that tells us something. Khrushchev came to power concurrently with the rise of television. In the late 40s and early 50s, the Hannah Arendt framing allowed anti-Hitler propaganda to be transitioned into anti-Stalin propaganda. But when the boomers were growing up in their suburban homes with a purpose-built TV room, the image of the Soviet Union was not Lenin and Stalin. It was Khrushchev banging a shoe on the desk, like
So
you said.
this is what our parents watched
Yep.
on TV.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is what
our parents, your grandparents.
This is what the boomers saw on TV while the commercials showed Americans driving Chevrolets and living in a detached house with a front lawn and fancy appliances.
Oh, okay.
So when TV was still relatively new and the networks needed to fill airtime with content that was cheap to produce, the one go-to that was part of the fabric of Americana was professional wrestling.
Yeah.
The Cold War was the golden age of the all-American face and the ethnic stereotype heel. And a lot of those ethnic stereotypes were Russian.
Oh, yeah. A lot of Nikolai Volkov. I go on and on.
Well, the classic Russian professional wrestling villain was never a lookalike of Joseph Stalin in the way that the Iron Sheik was clearly a parody of the Ayatollah.
Yeah.
It was always Khrushchev or whoever came after Khrushchev, Brezhnev or the old guys in the 80s.
Okay.
I said earlier that there were 3 visions of art in 1937. Hitler's vision was completely eradicated in 1945, and now we see what happened to the other one. Stalin's body was still warm when Khrushchev decided to undo everything, and that includes Stalin's vision of art. And since Khrushchev's tenure aligned with the golden age of television propaganda, Khrushchev's aesthetics entered everyone's consciousness, and Stalin's aesthetics were quickly forgotten. The Soviet academies were still following the theories of socialist realism, but the cult of Stalin just disappeared overnight. The cult of Stalin was at its peak after 1945, because what makes better propaganda than a victory in a massive war? Stalin was often portrayed in paintings as a solitary cerebral genius, which I'm not sure he was, but, art's going to art, propaganda going to propaganda. But as soon as Stalin died, he was immediately taken out of prints of official paintings. Like, here's an example. This is Sirov's Lenin Proclaims Soviet Power. On the left, you have the original painting where you see Stalin in the background. On the right, you see the reprint of it that appeared in a bunch of textbooks, and Stalin seems to be replaced by the Arab selling a rug at the market.
Live by the airbrush, die by the airbrush.
It's not even a very good airbrush,
No.
but does it matter?
Nope. Institutional power.
And what was to be done about Stalin's vision for the gigantic palace of Soviets, which had been a hole in the ground for 25 years, to the point where the hole was collapsing and needed to be restored? Simple. Khrushchev just canceled it and announced a competition for the design of a new palace that was capped at 500,000 cubic meters, which was, I think, 7% the volume of the Palace of Soviets that had been proposed.
Oh, wow.
So it was a little more realistic, a little more utilitarian.
He's now dacha.
So this is what it looked like.
This would be a nice dacha.
Yeah, this is the Palace of Congresses. There's nothing neoclassical or traditional about this. It's just a glass box in the Kremlin, which stands out like a sore thumb against the beautiful historical buildings.
I love that this is going to be impossible to heat in the winter and impossible to cool in the summer.
Yeah, just as the people who instituted the UN accuse Hitler of being bent on world domination, the people who plagued the world with brutalism managed to convince us all that it was a Soviet idea. But when this building was opened in 1961, the aesthetic of Gropius and Le Corbusier had won. It won the American university system in 1937. It was imposed on Germany after firebombing Dresden. It became a depressing symbol of American hegemony during the American century. And it became synonymous with the Soviet Union in the 1960s following this stuff being built. But the Soviet Union was late to the party. The Soviets were not the ones declaring every depressing concrete slab a UNESCO heritage site. When you watch a science fiction movie about a utopia, the architecture is always minimalist and geometric, and the UN was supposed to be the spiritual inspiration for Star Trek.
Yeah, even the Starfleet freaking logo looks like the UN logo.
Yeah, so instead of calling this Soviet architecture, we should probably call it United Nations architecture. I think that's a much more appropriate label. So that brings us to the end of this episode. But in Breaking Bad, Walter White had won everything when he defeated Gus Fring at the end of season 4. But there was still a season 5, and Walter hadn't reached happily ever after. Modernist architecture had won everything in the 60s when even the skyscrapers were designed based on the principles of worker housing. Even the UN building is a boring and uninspired glass box, so let it not be said that they aren't true believers. Like this is the UN building in New York, which is supposed to be the the powerhouse of the global utopia.
Also looks like the Starfleet building in whenever it's shown. This is the freaking government building of Star Trek.
So modernist architecture is riding high in the 60s, but the edifice came literally crashing down in the 70s with one housing project in St. Louis. Within 15 years, brutalism became the symbol of the futility of progressive utopianism, and intellectuals completely lost all faith in modernism, to the point where they couldn't decide on a new label for what comes next, so they just said, fuck it, we're postmodernist.
Oh, okay.
We are zeroing in on the end of our series because once we reach postmodernism, art has gotten ugly and the story's over.
For everybody that lived through a certain period of history, I know it's a loaded term, postmodernism. Just give us a chance to air this out and discuss this reasonably.
That brings us to the end of the episode. We've talked about Hitler. We've talked about Stalin. We've got one last storyline to tell. It'll probably take 2 or 3 episodes to get through, but we're going to start wrapping up this series and explain why previous generations got beautiful art and we got whatever the fuck this thing is.
Now, if you got to excuse me, guys, I got to go back to my concrete box.
All right, you know the drill. Like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Support us at kofi.com/Radio Free History or at subscribestar.com/radio-free-history.